A person deliberately inflicts suffering on another for no instrumental purpose whatsoever. This act appears to instantiate pure malevolence, yet our conceptual apparatus immediately fractures when we attempt to analyze what this means. If we claim the person acted from evil desire, we must explain how desire, fundamentally directed toward what appears good to the agent, can be genuinely evil rather than merely mistaken about genuine goods. If we deny the person had evil desire, we must explain how an act can be evil when emerging from non-evil mental states. This conceptual instability reveals that our notion of evil may be internally inconsistent, referring to something that cannot coherently exist as we typically conceive it. Every major philosophical theory of evil attempts to resolve this paradox while creating new conceptual problems that expose the fundamental difficulty of capturing evil's nature through systematic thought. Part 1. The logical structure of privation theory and its foundational assumptions. Augustine's privation theory operates on a crucial unstated assumption, that reality admits a hierarchy where being and goodness necessarily coincide. This assumption requires that whatever exists more fully must be better, and whatever is better must exist more fully. The theory cannot function without this ontological commitment, because if being and goodness can diverge, then something could exist fully while being evil, demolishing the entire framework. Yet this assumption generates immediate logical problems when tested against concrete cases involving substantial evil acts. Consider the logical structure required for privation theory to handle a case like systematic torture. The theory must analyze this as follows. The torturer possesses natural human capacities for compassion, justice, and mercy, but these capacities are diminished or corrupted rather than replaced by positive, malevolent capacities. The act of torture represents the operation of these diminished capacities rather than the operation of genuinely evil ones. However, this analysis reveals a critical logical gap. It cannot explain how diminished good capacities generate the specific, purposeful and creative features of sophisticated torture techniques. The theory faces what we can call the specificity problem. If evil is merely the absence of good, it should manifest as random degradation or simple failure to act virtuously, much like how the absence of light produces uniform darkness rather than specific patterns. Yet sophisticated evil acts display highly specific, purposeful structures that seem to require positive guidance toward particular ends. The privation theorist must explain how nothing can generate something as determinate and complex as an elaborate scheme of psychological manipulation designed to maximize suffering. This leads to a deeper logical contradiction within the theory's foundations. Privation theory relies on the principle that causal powers require positive reality, that only what exists can bring about effects. Yet the theory must somehow attribute significant causal power to evil while denying it positive existence. The torturer's evil must be causally efficacious enough to override natural compassion, plan complex actions, and resist moral correction, but it cannot possess the positive reality that would make such causal power intelligible. Examining the theory's treatment of moral psychology reveals another foundational assumption, that human nature is essentially oriented toward good. This assumption is necessary because if humans were naturally oriented toward evil, then evil acts would express natural positive capacities rather than privations of good ones. However, this assumption conflicts with empirical observations, suggesting that humans possess natural capacities for both altruism and aggression, cooperation and domination. The theory must either deny these observations or explain why natural aggressive capacities become evil only when they exceed some optimal level, which reintroduces the problem of determining what constitutes the proper amount of a natural capacity. The privation theory's logical structure also generates what we might call the degrees problem. If evil is simply the absence of good, then degrees of evil should correspond directly to degrees of absence. Someone completely lacking compassion should be more evil than someone possessing diminished compassion. Yet moral experience suggests a more complex relationship. Someone who possesses enough compassion to understand others' suffering, but chooses to cause it anyway, strikes us as more evil than someone who lacks empathetic understanding entirely. The theory cannot accommodate this judgment without admitting that evil sometimes increases with the presence of certain capacities rather than their absence. Testing the theory against cases of moral conversion reveals additional logical strain. When someone undergoes moral transformation from evil to good, privation theory must analyze this as the filling of an absence rather than the replacement of one positive quality with another. Yet, such conversions often involve struggle, resistance, and the need to overcome powerful, contrary inclinations. If the person were merely lacking good moral conversion, should be a simple matter of addition, like turning on a light in a dark room. The difficulty and resistance involved suggest that something positive must be displaced rather than simply supplemented. The theory's foundational assumption about the relationship between existence and value creates further difficulties when applied to moral responsibility. If evil acts flow from absences rather than positive qualities, it becomes unclear how we can hold people responsible for what they don't possess. We typically don't blame people for lacking abilities they never had, yet we do blame them for moral failures, even when these stem from absent virtues. The theory must either abandon moral responsibility for evil acts or provide an account of how absences can ground responsibility in ways that other kinds of absences cannot. Perhaps most problematically, the privation theory's logical structure appears to prove too much. If evil is always the absence of good, then any imperfection becomes a form of evil, since it represents the absence of greater perfection. This leads to the conclusion that everything except the highest possible good contains evil, which drains the concept of evil of any useful moral content. The theory needs some principled way to distinguish between mere imperfection and genuine evil, but cannot do so without introducing positive criteria that undermine the privation framework. The theory also faces logical difficulties in distinguishing between different types of absence. The absence of sight in a person born blind differs categorically from the absence of sight in someone whose eyes have been damaged. Similarly, the absence of compassion in someone who never developed this capacity differs from its absence in someone whose compassion has been corrupted or suppressed. Yet privation theory treats all absences of good as essentially identical, losing these crucial distinctions that seem necessary for understanding different types of moral failure. Part 2. The problem of evil intentionality and motivational structure. Every theory of evil must explain how evil intentions can exist, given the apparent logical constraint that all intentional action aims at what the agent perceives as good. This creates what philosophers call the motivational paradox. If agents necessarily act for reasons that appear good to them, then either evil acts are impossible, or our understanding of intentional action is fundamentally mistaken. Aristotle captured this problem by arguing that no one acts voluntarily toward what they believe is bad for them, yet we clearly need to account for cases where people seem to choose evil for its own sake. Resolving this paradox requires either reconstructing our theory of motivation or demonstrating that apparently evil intentions reduce to some form of mistaken good-seeking. Consider the case of someone who takes pleasure in another's pain without any instrumental benefit. Traditional motivational theory suggests this person must be seeking something they perceive as good, perhaps the feeling of power, the satisfaction of revenge, or the resolution of psychological tension. Under this analysis, the person's action aims at genuine goods, but employs evil means or exhibits disordered priorities among goods. However, this reduction faces the counterexample of purely malicious acts, where the agent seems to seek the other's pain precisely as pain, not as a means to any further good. The reduction strategy encounters what we can call the phenomenological objection. When we examine cases of hatred, malice, or spite from the first-person perspective, these emotions appear to be directed toward genuine bad outcomes rather than confused good ones. Someone consumed by hatred toward another person seems to want that person to suffer specifically because suffering is bad for them, not because the hater mistakes suffering for something good. If we insist that the hater must really be seeking some good, we make the empirical claim that careful introspection will always reveal hidden good-seeking motivations, but this claim appears false to the reported experience of moral agents. Examining the logical structure of malicious intentions reveals further complications for the reduction strategy. Malice seems to require that the agent understand the badness of what they intend. A person cannot be truly malicious towards someone without grasping that their intended actions will harm that person. Yet if the agent grasps the badness of their intended effects, how can they simultaneously be seeking these effects under the aspect of goodness? The reduction strategy must claim that agents can simultaneously represent the same outcome as both good and bad, which appears to violate basic principles of rational coherence. The alternative approach argues that evil intentions possess a sui generis structure that cannot be reduced to good-seeking. Under this view, malicious agents can be directly motivated by the recognition that their actions will cause bad outcomes for others. This requires abandoning the Aristotelian principle that all intentional action aims at the good, but it better captures the phenomenology of malicious motivation. However, this approach faces its own logical difficulties in explaining how rational agents can choose outcomes they recognize as bad without this choice being somehow irrational or compulsive. Testing these competing approaches against cases of sadism reveals their respective strengths and weaknesses. A sadist who tortures victims appears to be motivated by the victim's pain itself, rather than by any good that pain might produce. The reduction approach must argue that the sadist seeks pleasure, power, or psychological satisfaction, treating the victim's pain merely as a means to these goods. Yet careful examination suggests that for genuine sadists, others' pain is not merely instrumental but constitutes part of what they directly desire. This leads to questions about the relationship between evil intentions and practical reasoning. If someone can be directly motivated by bad outcomes, can they engage in genuine practical reasoning about how to achieve these outcomes? It seems they can. Malicious agents often display sophisticated reasoning about how to maximize their victim's suffering while avoiding detection. This suggests that evil intentions can ground coherent practical reasoning, which challenges theories that treat evil as necessarily involving some form of rational defect or confusion. The motivational paradox also appears in cases involving moral emotions like guilt, shame, and regret. These emotions seem to presuppose that agents can recognize their own actions as genuinely bad, rather than merely mistaken attempts at good. If evil acts were always misdirected good-seeking, then moral emotions should focus on correcting mistakes rather than expressing genuine remorse for having done evil. Yet the phenomenology of guilt suggests agents believe they have done something genuinely wrong rather than simply made an error in pursuing good ends. Examining collective evil acts like genocide raises additional questions about motivational structure. Participants in such acts often claim they believed their actions served good ends like racial purity or national security. This appears to support the reduction approach by showing that even extreme evil involves misdirected good-seeking. However, this analysis may be too charitable, ignoring evidence that participants often understood they were causing unjustified suffering, but participated anyway due to hatred, fear, or indifference rather than genuine belief in good outcomes. The problem becomes more complex when we consider the relationship between evil intentions and the agent's overall motivational economy. Someone might simultaneously possess both good-directed and evil-directed motivations, creating internal conflict rather than simple reduction of one to the other. This suggests that evil intentions might coexist with good ones rather than being eliminable in favor of confused good-seeking. Understanding evil may require accepting that human motivational structure is more complex and contradictory than traditional theories assume. Part 3. Natural evil versus moral evil, category confusion or valid distinction. The distinction between natural evils like earthquakes and diseases versus moral evils like murder and theft appears fundamental to ethical thinking, yet this distinction faces serious logical challenges when examined systematically. Natural evils lack the intentional structure that seems necessary for genuine evil, while moral evils require the presence of agents capable of understanding and choosing between right and wrong. However, this neat division breaks down when we consider cases like criminal negligence, where human choices contribute to natural disasters, or genetic predispositions toward violence, where natural factors influence moral behavior. The distinction may reflect conceptual confusion rather than a genuine difference in the nature of evil itself. Consider the logical structure required for something to count as a natural evil. The category seems to require that natural events cause suffering without this being the result of any intentional choice by moral agents. Yet this definition immediately encounters boundary problems. Human actions have so extensively modified natural systems that pure natural events no longer exist. Climate change exemplifies this difficulty. Extreme weather events result from the interaction of natural systems with human industrial activity, making them neither purely natural nor straightforwardly moral evils. The natural evil category also faces what we can call the teleological problem. To describe natural events as evil seems to presuppose that nature ought to operate differently than it does, implying some standard of how natural systems should function. But natural systems simply operate according to physical laws, without any inherent purposes that could be frustrated or goals that could be thwarted. Calling earthquakes evil appears to commit a category error, anthropomorphizing natural processes that lack the intentional structure necessary for moral evaluation. However, defending the validity of natural evil requires addressing why we have such strong intuitive reactions to natural disasters. When thousands die in earthquakes or pandemics, our response goes beyond mere sadness at unfortunate events to something approaching moral outrage. This suggests that the concept of natural evil captures something important about our relationship to suffering that cannot be reduced to mere regret about unfortunate outcomes. Perhaps natural evil refers not to properties of natural events themselves, but to their relationship to human flourishing and our legitimate expectations about how the world should treat us. Testing the distinction against cases of mental illness reveals additional complexities. When someone commits violent acts due to severe psychosis, we face a hybrid case that resists classification as either purely natural or purely moral evil. The person's brain dysfunction is a natural condition, yet their actions involve intentional choices that cause harm to others. Traditional approaches handle this by diminishing moral responsibility proportionally to the degree of mental impairment, but this solution assumes we can clearly separate natural factors from moral ones within a single case. The distinction faces further pressure from cases involving social institutions and collective action. When economic systems predictably generate poverty that leads to preventable deaths, we seem to have something that is neither natural evil nor individual moral evil. The causal chain involves countless individual choices, institutional structures, and systemic effects that make assigning clear moral responsibility impossible. These cases suggest we need additional categories beyond the natural moral distinction, or that the distinction itself obscures more than it clarifies. Examining the historical development of the natural-moral-evil distinction reveals its theological origins in attempts to defend divine goodness. If God is perfectly good and omnipotent, then moral evil can be attributed to human free will, while natural evil presents a more direct challenge to divine benevolence. This theological context explains why the distinction has seemed so important, but it also suggests that the categories may not be appropriate for secular ethical theory. Without the theological framework, the distinction may lose its theoretical motivation and become merely a conventional way of organizing different types of harmful events. The problem becomes more acute when we consider evolutionary explanations for both natural disasters and moral behavior. If human moral capacities evolved through natural selection, then moral evil represents the misuse of naturally evolved capacities rather than something categorically different from natural events. Similarly, if natural disasters serve evolutionary functions by maintaining ecological balance or driving evolutionary adaptation, then they cannot be straightforwardly characterized as evil. Evolutionary perspectives suggest that both moral and natural evils may be natural phenomena that appear evil only from the limited perspective of human interests. Analyzing the distinction through the lens of causal responsibility reveals additional difficulties. We typically assign moral responsibility to agents who could have acted differently. But the line between what agents can and cannot control is far more blurred than the natural moral distinction suggests. Genetic predispositions, cultural conditioning, unconscious biases, and situational pressures all influence moral behavior in ways that partially excuse agents without completely eliminating responsibility. This suggests that moral and natural factors typically interact rather than operating in separate domains. The temporal dimension adds another layer of complexity to the distinction. Natural events like climate change operate on timescales that exceed individual moral responsibility, yet result from the accumulation of individually minor moral choices over extended periods. Similarly, moral traditions and cultural practices shape individual choices across generations in ways that blur the boundary between natural cultural evolution and individual moral responsibility. The distinction may work better for immediate, clearly intentional acts than for complex causal chains extending across time and involving multiple agents. Part 4. The Radical Evil Thesis, Kant's analysis of fundamental corruption. Kant's concept of radical evil attempts to solve the motivational paradox by locating evil not in particular desires or actions, but in the fundamental structure of practical reasoning itself. According to this theory, humans possess an innate propensity to subordinate moral duty to self-interest, not because they lack knowledge of moral requirements, but because they systematically prioritize their own happiness over moral obligations. This propensity is radical, because it affects the root of all moral choice, and it is evil, because it involves the willful inversion of the proper moral order, where duty should take priority over inclination. However, this analysis generates immediate logical difficulties about moral responsibility, the nature of choice, and the possibility of moral improvement. The logical structure of radical evil requires that the propensity to evil be both innate and chosen. It must be innate to explain why all humans exhibit moral failure despite possessing rational knowledge of their moral duties. Yet it must also be chosen to ground moral responsibility. We cannot be blamed for propensities that are simply natural facts about human psychology, like hunger or fatigue. Kant attempts to resolve this tension by arguing that the propensity results from an intelligible choice that occurs outside the temporal sequence of empirical causation. But this solution raises more problems than it solves. The concept of intelligible choice faces the logical problem of how atemporal acts can have temporal consequences. If the choice to adopt evil maxims occurs outside time, then it cannot be causally connected to particular empirical actions that occur within time through normal causal relations. Yet these temporal actions are precisely what we need to explain through the radical evil thesis. The theory must either abandon the intelligible choice framework or explain how timeless acts can generate specific temporal effects without violating the causal closure of the empirical world. Testing the theory against cases of moral education reveals additional logical strain. If radical evil involves a fundamental propensity that affects all moral reasoning, then moral education should be either impossible or ineffective, since it must work through the same corrupted rational faculties. Yet we observe that moral education can be effective, and people can undergo genuine moral improvement throughout their lives. The theory must either explain how corrupted practical reasoning can recognize and correct its own corruption, or admit that the propensity to evil is not as fundamental as initially claimed. The theory also faces difficulties in explaining moral variation among individuals. If all humans possess the same radical propensity to evil, we should expect roughly similar levels of moral failure across different people and cultures. Yet empirical observation reveals dramatic differences in moral behavior that seem to reflect more than mere variation in external circumstances. Some individuals display consistent patterns of moral excellence, while others exhibit systematic moral failure, suggesting that the propensity to evil is not universally distributed in the way Kant's theory requires. Examining the relationship between radical evil and particular evil acts reveals another logical problem. The theory claims that specific moral failures result from the general propensity to subordinate duty to self-interest, but this causal relationship remains unclear. In any particular case of moral failure, the agent might be following self-interest, but they might also be acting from confused understanding, emotional overwhelm, or acratic weakness, rather than from the systematic priority inversion that defines radical evil. The theory needs some way to distinguish cases that genuinely exemplify radical evil from other types of moral failure, but cannot do so without circular reasoning that presupposes what it attempts to prove. The theory's account of moral motivation faces additional difficulties when tested against cases involving moral emotions. Someone who feels genuine guilt, shame, or remorse about moral failures, seems to be prioritizing moral considerations over self-interest, contradicting the claim that they systematically subordinate duty to happiness. Similarly, people who make significant personal sacrifices for moral reasons appear to be following duty over inclination in ways that should be impossible given universal radical evil. The theory must either explain these cases as mere appearances that mask underlying self-interest, or admit that the propensity to evil is not as comprehensive as originally claimed. Kant's analysis of the highest good creates further complications for the radical evil thesis. The highest good involves the harmony of virtue and happiness, suggesting that moral agents can legitimately pursue their own happiness as long as they do so in accordance with moral duty. But if pursuing happiness is not inherently problematic, then the radical evil cannot consist simply in giving priority to happiness over duty. The theory needs a more sophisticated account of when the pursuit of happiness becomes evil, but developing such an account threatens to undermine the systematic character that makes evil radical. The temporal paradox of moral responsibility creates additional logical problems for the theory. If the propensity to evil results from an intelligible choice, then moral agents are responsible for this choice and its consequences throughout their empirical lives. Yet they cannot be responsible for making the original choice, since responsibility requires the ability to choose otherwise, and the intelligible choice determines the character from which all subsequent choices flow. This generates an infinite regress, where each responsible choice presupposes a prior character-determining choice for which the agent cannot be responsible. The theory's relationship to moral progress and social reform raises further questions about its logical consistency. If all humans are radically evil, then any social or political arrangements they create should reflect this corruption, making genuine moral progress impossible. Yet, Kant himself advocates for republican government, international law and other institutional reforms that seem to presuppose the possibility of moral improvement, both individually and collectively. The theory must either explain how radically evil beings can create institutions that transcend their corruption, or abandon the claim that evil affects all aspects of human moral agency. Part 5. Evil as Banal. Arendt's challenge to exceptional evil. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil fundamentally challenges traditional philosophical approaches by arguing that the most significant evil acts often result from thoughtlessness and conformity rather than exceptional malice or radical corruption. Her analysis of Adolf Eichmann suggests that his participation in genocide stemmed not from deep hatred or ideological commitment, but from careerism, bureaucratic mindset, and inability to think critically about his actions. This thesis threatens traditional moral philosophy by suggesting that ordinary cognitive limitations and social pressures can generate extreme evil without requiring any extraordinary moral defects in individual agents. However, the banality thesis faces serious logical challenges regarding moral responsibility, the relationship between intention and evil, and the adequacy of purely descriptive approaches to normative phenomena. The logical structure of Arendt's argument depends on distinguishing between evil as a moral category and evil as a political phenomenon. As a political theorist, rather than a moral philosopher, Arendt focuses on the conditions that make large-scale evil possible rather than the moral status of individual evil acts. From this perspective, the banality of evil explains how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary crimes through institutional structures that diffuse responsibility and normalize harmful actions. However, This approach creates ambiguity about whether the banality thesis makes claims about the nature of evil itself, or merely about the social conditions that enable evil acts. Testing the banality thesis against cases of systematic cruelty reveals both its explanatory power and its limitations. Many perpetrators of atrocities do appear to be ordinary people who became caught up in systems that gradually normalized increasingly harmful actions. The incremental nature of moral corruption supports Arendt's emphasis on thoughtlessness rather than conscious evil choice. Yet some cases involve individuals who seem to take active pleasure in causing suffering or who go beyond what their roles require, suggesting that thoughtlessness alone cannot account for all forms of complicity in evil systems. The relationship between thoughtlessness and moral responsibility creates a central logical problem for the banality thesis. If evil acts result primarily from cognitive limitations rather than moral choices, then traditional frameworks of blame and punishment become problematic. We typically hold people responsible for their actions only when they possess sufficient understanding and control. But the banality thesis suggests that the most harmful evil acts occur precisely when these conditions are absent. This leads either to the conclusion that no one is responsible for banal evil, or that responsibility must be reconceived in ways that traditional moral philosophy has not adequately developed. Examining the banality thesis through the lens of moral education reveals additional complications. If evil results from thoughtlessness, then moral education should focus on developing critical thinking skills rather than building character or strengthening moral motivation. Yet this approach faces the problem that many highly educated and intellectually sophisticated people have participated in evil systems, suggesting that cognitive capacity alone is insufficient to prevent moral failure. The thesis must either explain why education fails to prevent thoughtlessness or acknowledge that factors beyond mere cognitive limitation contribute to evil acts. The banality thesis also struggles with cases involving resistance to evil systems. Some individuals manage to maintain moral clarity and resist participation in evil systems despite facing the same social pressures and institutional structures as those who comply. If evil results from ordinary thoughtlessness, we need to explain why some people prove more resistant to this thoughtlessness than others. This explanation threatens to reintroduce precisely the kind of moral psychology that the banality thesis seeks to avoid by suggesting that moral resistance requires exceptional moral qualities rather than ordinary cognitive functioning. The relationship between individual banality and systemic evil creates further logical tensions. Even if individual participants in evil systems are merely thoughtless rather than actively malicious, the systems themselves display purposeful, coordinated structure directed toward harmful ends. Someone must design these systems, coordinate their operation, and maintain their focus on harmful objectives. The banality thesis must either explain how thoughtless individuals can collectively create purposeful evil systems, or acknowledge that some individuals within these systems display more than mere thoughtlessness. Arendt's emphasis on the novelty of totalitarian evil creates additional problems for the banality thesis. She argues that totalitarian movements represent unprecedented forms of political organization that cannot be understood through traditional moral categories. Yet the banality thesis seems to suggest that totalitarian evil involves familiar human failings like thoughtlessness and conformity rather than genuinely novel forms of evil. This creates tension within Arendt's own framework between emphasizing the unprecedented character of totalitarian evil and explaining it through ordinary human psychological mechanisms. The temporal dimension of banal evil raises questions about moral development and the possibility of recognition. If individuals become complicit in evil through gradual processes that normalize harmful actions, at what point do they acquire moral knowledge sufficient to ground responsibility? The banality thesis suggests that participants may never fully understand what they are doing, but this conflicts with evidence that many participants do develop awareness of the harmful consequences of their actions while continuing to participate. This suggests that something beyond mere thoughtlessness, perhaps willful ignorance or motivated reasoning, contributes to sustained participation in evil systems. The banality thesis faces its most serious challenge in explaining the relationship between ordinary moral failure and extraordinary moral catastrophe. While thoughtlessness and conformity may explain individual compliance with harmful systems, they cannot by themselves explain why such systems arise or why they take particularly destructive forms. The thesis needs supplementation with accounts of how ordinary human failings interact with specific historical, cultural, and institutional conditions to generate systematic evil. Without such supplementation, the banality thesis risks trivializing genuine moral catastrophes by reducing them to mere consequences of ordinary cognitive limitations. Part 6. The problem of moral luck and evil actions. The concept of moral luck creates fundamental problems for assessing evil by revealing that factors beyond agents' control significantly influence both the occurrence and severity of harmful actions. Two equally reckless drivers who make identical choices may have vastly different outcomes due to the fortuitous presence or absence of pedestrians, making one a careless driver and the other a killer through no difference in intention or character. This asymmetry suggests that our judgments of evil depend partly on lucky or unlucky circumstances rather than purely on what agents choose or control. Yet, if evil judgments must be sensitive to luck, then they cannot serve their apparent function of tracking moral responsibility and desert in ways that ground punishment, blame, and character assessment. Constitutive moral luck poses the deepest challenge to evil assessment by questioning whether agents control the fundamental features of personality and character that appear to ground moral responsibility. An individual's genetic endowment, early childhood experiences, cultural background, and formative relationships all influence their propensity toward harmful or beneficial actions in ways that seem beyond their ultimate control. Someone born with genetic predispositions toward aggression and raised in an abusive environment may be more likely to commit violent acts than someone with different genetic and environmental luck. If these background factors significantly influence moral behavior, then judging people as evil may be no more appropriate than judging them as tall or short. The attempt to preserve moral responsibility by focusing on what agents can control faces immediate difficulties in determining the scope of genuine control. Every human action emerges from prior psychological states, beliefs, desires, and dispositions that themselves result from factors beyond ultimate control. Even seemingly voluntary choices, like whether to cultivate virtuous habits or resist temptation, depend on higher-order motivational states that agents did not originally choose. This generates a regress where each level of choice presupposes prior psychological conditions that were themselves not chosen, potentially eliminating genuine control entirely. Testing the moral luck problem against specific evil acts reveals how deeply luck penetrates moral assessment. Consider someone who commits murder during a psychotic episode caused by previously undiagnosed mental illness triggered by environmental stress. Their action causes tremendous harm and displays the intentional structure characteristic of evil acts, yet multiple levels of luck, genetic, environmental and circumstantial, contributed to the outcome. Traditional frameworks struggle to determine how much moral responsibility remains after accounting for these luck factors, potentially leaving nothing that can ground definitive judgments of evil. The relationship between moral luck and degrees of evil creates additional complications. We typically judge more harmful acts as more evil, but harm levels depend significantly on circumstances beyond agents' control. A terrorist's bomb may kill many people, or few depending on traffic patterns, building construction, and emergency response times that the terrorist could not predict or control. If evil judgments should track only what agents control, then these circumstantial factors should be irrelevant, yet they seem central to our assessment of the action's moral gravity. Examining collective evil through the lens of moral luck reveals how social and historical circumstances influence individual participation in harmful systems. Someone born in a society that normalizes certain harmful practices faces different moral pressures than someone born where these practices are widely condemned. The historical timing of their birth, the particular social environment they encounter, and the specific roles available to them all represent forms of circumstantial luck that influence their likelihood of participating in collective evil. This suggests that cross-cultural and cross-historical moral judgments may be problematic if they ignore the different luck conditions that different agents face. The problem of moral luck intersects with questions about moral development and the possibility of character change. If someone's evil character results from unlucky formative experiences, can they be held responsible for failing to overcome these influences through later moral development? This question becomes more complex when we consider that the capacity for moral development itself may be influenced by luck factors like educational opportunities, exposure to moral exemplars, and supportive relationships. The theory must either explain how agents can transcend their luck conditions through genuine moral effort, or accept that evil judgments are inevitably contaminated by factors beyond agents' control. Resultant moral luck creates specific problems for consequentialist approaches to evil that focus on harmful outcomes rather than evil intentions. If the moral status of actions depends on their consequences, then identical intentions and efforts can generate different moral assessments depending on lucky or unlucky circumstances that affect outcomes. This makes moral assessment depend on factors that agents cannot predict or control, which conflicts with the intuitive requirement that moral judgments should track features of agents rather than features of the world beyond their influence. Consequentialist theories must either accept this counterintuitive result or explain why moral assessment should be insensitive to actual consequences. The temporal dimension of moral luck raises questions about how long agents remain responsible for the consequences of their actions. An evil act committed in youth may have consequences that unfold over decades through causal chains that the agent could not foresee or control. Are they morally responsible for all these consequences, only the immediately foreseeable ones, or only the consequences that result from aspects of their action that were genuinely under their control? Each answer faces counterintuitive implications that either make agents responsible for too much or too little relative to common moral judgments. The moral luck problem ultimately forces a choice between preserving moral responsibility by ignoring luck factors or acknowledging luck factors by undermining moral responsibility. Neither option seems satisfactory for a complete theory of evil that must both track genuine moral facts and serve practical functions in human social life. The problem suggests that evil may be a more complex and contextual phenomenon than traditional approaches assume, requiring frameworks that can accommodate both agential control and situational influence without reducing either to the other. This points toward more nuanced approaches to moral assessment that recognize degrees of responsibility rather than seeking definitive judgments about evil character or actions. Part 7. Consequentialist versus deontological approaches to evil. The fundamental disagreement between consequentialist and deontological approaches to evil centers on whether the moral status of actions depends entirely on their outcomes or includes irreducible facts about the intrinsic rightness or wrongness of certain action types. Consequentialists argue that actions are evil only insofar as they produce bad consequences, making torture evil because it causes suffering rather than because torture violates any inherent moral constraints. Deontologists contend that certain actions like torture are intrinsically evil regardless of consequences, remaining wrong even if they somehow produced optimal outcomes. This disagreement generates systematic differences in how the approaches handle cases involving moral dilemmas, collective action, and the relationship between individual evil and social harm. The consequentialist approach faces immediate challenges in specifying which consequences matter for determining evil and how different types of consequences should be weighed against each other. A simple hedonistic consequentialism that focuses only on pleasure and pain cannot adequately capture all the ways that actions can be harmful. Violations of autonomy, fairness and dignity seem to matter independently of their effects on subjective well-being. Yet expanding the consequentialist framework to include multiple types of intrinsic goods threatens to collapse into a deontological approach that treats certain values as good in themselves rather than merely as means to further consequences. The theory must either accept an impoverished account of relevant consequences or abandon the purely consequentialist framework. Testing consequentialism against cases involving rights violations reveals fundamental difficulties. Consider a scenario where torturing one innocent person would prevent a terrorist attack that kills thousands of people. Pure consequentialist reasoning suggests that torture would be required since it prevents greater overall harm. Yet this conflicts with widespread moral intuitions that torture remains evil regardless of its beneficial consequences. Consequentialists must either accept that torture can be morally required, or explain why their theoretical framework should yield conclusions that conflict with common moral judgments about the intrinsic wrongness of certain actions. The problem becomes more complex when consequentialists attempt to accommodate moral intuitions through indirect strategies. Rule consequentialism argues that we should follow rules that generally produce good consequences rather than calculating consequences in each particular case. This allows prohibiting torture even when it would produce good outcomes in specific instances, since general rules against torture typically produce better consequences than case-by-case calculation. However, this solution faces the logical problem that cases where torture would genuinely produce optimal consequences challenge the rule, and it remains unclear why rule following should override consequence maximizing when the two conflict. Deontological approaches face their own difficulties in explaining the source and content of moral constraints that make certain actions intrinsically evil. Kant's categorical imperative attempts to ground these constraints in the requirements of rational agency, arguing that actions are evil when they treat rational beings merely as means rather than as ends in themselves. Yet this formulation generates counterintuitive results in cases where treating someone as a mere means produces better outcomes for everyone involved, including the person being so treated. The theory must either accept these counterintuitive results or provide additional principles that determine when treating persons as means is prohibited versus permitted. The universalizability test creates further problems for Kantian deontology when applied to evil actions. The test requires determining whether we can will that everyone follow the maxim underlying a particular action, but this generates indeterminate results for many cases of apparent evil. Lying provides Kant's clearest example, since universal lying would undermine the institution of truth-telling that makes lying possible. Yet many other potentially evil actions do not involve this self-defeating structure, and determining the appropriate level of description for universalizability testing often predetermines the moral conclusion rather than providing independent moral guidance. Natural law approaches to deontology attempt to ground intrinsic evil in facts about human nature, and flourishing rather than in purely formal constraints of rational agency. Actions are evil when they conflict with natural human purposes or prevent the realization of characteristically human goods. This approach better explains why we consider certain types of actions evil across different cultural and historical contexts, since they violate universal features of human nature. However, the approach faces difficulties in determining which aspects of human nature are morally relevant, and how to adjudicate conflicts between different natural human purposes when these come into tension. Examining collective evil reveals systematic differences between consequentialist and deontological approaches to institutional and social responsibility. Consequentialists can relatively easily explain why participating in harmful institutions is evil by pointing to the cumulative bad consequences of such participation. Deontologists must explain why individual participation in collective evil is intrinsically wrong, even when any particular individual's contribution makes negligible difference to overall outcomes. This requires either expanding deontological constraints to cover participation in collective action, or accepting that individual participation in collective evil may not be intrinsically wrong, despite its contribution to harmful systems. The two approaches also differ systematically in their treatment of moral emotions and reactive attitudes toward evil. Consequentialist frameworks suggest that guilt, resentment, and indignation are justified only when they produce good consequences by deterring future harmful behavior or expressing solidarity with victims. Deontological approaches treat these emotions as appropriate responses to intrinsic wrongness, regardless of their consequences, making them fitting reactions to moral facts rather than merely useful psychological mechanisms. This difference has implications for practices of punishment, forgiveness, and moral education that rely on moral emotions to motivate appropriate responses to evil actions. The disagreement between approaches extends to questions about moral progress and the possibility of resolving disagreements about evil. Consequentialists can appeal to improved empirical knowledge about consequences and better methods for calculating overall well-being to resolve moral disputes. Deontologists must explain how we can gain knowledge of intrinsic moral constraints and how to adjudicate disputes when people disagree about which actions violate these constraints. Each approach faces different meta-ethical challenges in explaining the nature of moral knowledge and the possibility of moral truth that affects their practical adequacy for guiding responses to evil. Part 8. The social construction of evil categories. The boundaries of what societies classify as evil vary dramatically across cultures and historical periods in ways that suggest evil categories are partially constructed through social processes rather than tracking purely objective moral facts. Actions that some societies consider heinously evil, such as certain sexual practices, religious expressions, or economic arrangements, other societies treat as morally neutral or even praiseworthy. This variation challenges universalist approaches to evil by suggesting that what counts as evil depends significantly on contingent social factors like power relations, cultural narratives, and collective identity formation. However, the social construction thesis faces serious logical problems in explaining cross-cultural moral criticism, moral progress, and the apparent universality of certain core moral prohibitions against unprovoked harm. The strongest evidence for social construction comes from examining how evil categories serve social functions beyond their apparent moral content. Designating certain groups as evil often helps societies maintain internal cohesion by creating external enemies and scapegoats for social problems. Similarly, evil categories can legitimate existing power structures by portraying challenges to authority as inherently wrongful rather than potentially justified forms of resistance. These social functions suggest that evil categorization involves motivated reasoning designed to serve group interests rather than purely objective assessment of moral facts. Testing the social construction thesis against cases involving moral entrepreneurs reveals how individuals and groups actively work to construct new evil categories or extend existing ones. The temperance movement successfully convinced American society that alcohol consumption was a serious moral evil requiring legal prohibition, while later generations rejected this categorization entirely. Environmental activists have worked to construct new categories of ecological evil that previous generations did not recognize, often meeting resistance from those whose interests conflict with environmental protection. These cases suggest that evil categories can be deliberately manufactured through social movement activity rather than simply discovered through moral insight. However, the social construction thesis must explain why some attempted constructions of evil succeed while others fail, and why certain core prohibitions appear across virtually all human societies. Efforts to construct moral evil categories around activities like consensual adult sexuality have largely failed in liberal societies despite significant social movement activity. Conversely, prohibitions against unprovoked killing, theft, and deception appear in some form across all known human cultures, suggesting universal moral constraints that resist social construction. Pure constructivism cannot explain this pattern without appealing to objective moral facts or universal features of human nature that constrain social construction processes. The relationship between social construction and moral responsibility creates additional logical difficulties. If evil categories are socially constructed, then individuals who violate these categories may not be genuinely responsible for evil acts, but merely for violating contingent social norms. This threatens to undermine practices of punishment, blame, and moral education that presuppose genuine moral wrongdoing rather than mere norm violation. The thesis must either accept this revisionist conclusion or explain how socially constructed evil categories can ground genuine moral responsibility despite their constructed character. Examining historical changes in evil categories reveals both evidence for and against social construction. The gradual expansion of moral consideration to include previously excluded groups, women, racial minorities, future generations, appears to represent moral progress rather than mere change in social construction. Yet the processes through which these changes occurred involved social movement activity, political struggle and cultural transformation that look very much like social construction processes. This suggests either that moral progress operates through social construction mechanisms, or that apparent social construction actually involves the discovery of previously unrecognized moral truths. The globalization of moral discourse creates new challenges for understanding the social construction of evil categories. International human rights frameworks attempt to establish universal evil categories that transcend particular cultural constructions. Yet these frameworks emerged from specific historical and cultural contexts that may not be representative of all human moral experience. The tension between respecting cultural diversity and maintaining universal moral standards creates dilemmas about when cross-cultural moral criticism is appropriate versus when it represents cultural imperialism disguised as moral objectivity. Resolving these dilemmas requires some account of which aspects of evil categorization are genuinely universal versus culturally relative. The role of narratives and symbolic systems in constructing evil categories reveals the deep connection between moral and cultural classification. Societies construct archetypal evil figures, witches, heretics, traitors, deviants, that organize moral thinking by providing concrete examples of what should be feared and condemned. These figures often combine moral content with cultural anxieties about social change, economic disruption, or challenges to traditional authority structures. The cultural embedding of evil categories suggests that understanding evil requires attention to symbolic and narrative dimensions that pure philosophical analysis may miss. The social construction thesis also raises questions about the possibility of moral knowledge and the nature of ethical expertise. If evil categories reflect social construction rather than moral discovery, then claims to moral expertise become suspect as disguised assertions of cultural power rather than genuine knowledge claims. Yet societies clearly need some way to distinguish between reasonable and unreasonable moral positions, and pure relativism about evil would undermine the possibility of moral criticism, even within particular cultural contexts. The thesis requires a sophisticated account of how socially constructed categories can nevertheless be more or less adequate for human moral purposes, without being simply objective or subjective. The interaction between individual moral judgment and social evil categories creates additional complexity for the social construction thesis. Individuals often experience genuine moral conviction about the evil of certain actions, even when they recognize that their judgments reflect cultural influences. Similarly, people can develop moral criticisms of their own society's evil categories, suggesting that individual moral reflection can transcend social construction to some degree. The thesis must explain how individual and social levels of moral judgment interact without reducing one entirely to the other, or treating them as completely independent domains. Part 9. Evil and free will, compatibility problems. The relationship between evil and free will creates fundamental logical problems because evil acts seem to require both that agents freely choose to perform them and that their choices are determined by prior causes that explain why evil occurred. If evil acts result from free choices that could have been otherwise, then their occurrence remains mysterious. Why would rational agents with knowledge of right and wrong freely choose to do evil? Conversely, if evil acts are causally determined by prior factors like genetics, environment, or psychological conditioning, then agents lack the freedom necessary for genuine moral responsibility and blame. This dilemma appears to show that either evil is impossible or moral responsibility is an illusion. threatening both moral practice and theoretical understanding of human agency. Hard determinists resolve the dilemma by denying genuine free will and arguing that evil represents a misguided category that should be replaced with causal explanation and therapeutic intervention. According to this view, what we call evil behavior results from identifiable causal factors like brain dysfunction, genetic predisposition, traumatic conditioning, or social environmental influences. Understanding these causal mechanisms should lead us to abandon blame and punishment in favor of treatment and prevention, much as we treat physical illness through medical intervention rather than moral condemnation. However, this approach faces difficulties in explaining why we should preserve some moral categories like helping others while eliminating others like refraining from harm, and why therapeutic intervention is preferable to punishment if neither involves genuine moral choice. Libertarian approaches to free will attempt to preserve moral responsibility by arguing that human agents possess genuine causal power that allows them to initiate action without being wholly determined by prior causes. Under this view, evil acts represent genuine choices that agents make using their undetermined free will, even though these choices may be influenced by background factors that make evil more or less likely. This preserves the possibility of moral responsibility and blame while explaining evil as the result of agents' misuse of their freedom rather than mere causal determination. Yet libertarian free will faces logical difficulties in explaining how undetermined choices can be rational and controlled rather than merely random, and how agents can be responsible for choices that by definition lack sufficient causal explanation. The randomness problem for libertarian free will becomes particularly acute when applied to evil actions. If evil choices are partially undetermined, then they involve an element of randomness that seems to excuse rather than enhance moral responsibility. We typically don't hold people responsible for random events, and introducing randomness into the causal history of action appears to diminish rather than increase the agent's control over outcomes. The libertarian must explain how undetermined choice differs from mere chance in ways that ground rather than undermine moral responsibility. But this explanation threatens to reintroduce the kind of causal determination that libertarianism seeks to avoid. Compatibilist approaches attempt to preserve both causal determinism and moral responsibility by arguing that free will is compatible with determinism when actions flow from an agent's own desires, values, and rational reflection. Evil acts can be both causally determined and freely chosen if they result from the agent's own moral character and deliberative processes, even though these processes themselves have causal histories. Someone who commits murder after careful deliberation acts freely, even if their deliberative capacity and moral character were shaped by factors beyond their control. This approach preserves moral responsibility while acknowledging the causal influences that shape human behavior, but faces challenges in explaining why some causal influences are compatible with freedom while others undermine it. Testing compatibilism against cases involving moral education and character development reveals additional logical difficulties. If someone's evil character results from unfortunate circumstances like abusive childhood, genetic predisposition or cultural conditioning, it becomes unclear why they should be held responsible for actions that flow from this character. The compatibilist argues that responsibility requires only that actions flow from the agent's own character, but this response seems inadequate when the character itself results from factors beyond the agent's control. The approach must either extend moral responsibility backward to cover character formation, or explain why agents can be responsible for expressing character they did not choose to develop. The relationship between moral knowledge and free choice in evil acts creates further complications for all approaches to free will. Evil acts often seem to require that agents understand the moral significance of their actions. Otherwise, the acts would be merely harmful rather than genuinely evil. Yet if agents possess genuine moral knowledge, it becomes puzzling why they would freely choose to act against this knowledge, suggesting either that their knowledge is incomplete or that their choice is not genuinely free. This creates a dilemma where evil acts require both moral understanding and genuine choice, but the combination of these requirements makes evil choices appear either impossible or irrational. The temporal dimension of free will and evil raises questions about the persistence of moral responsibility across time. Someone who commits evil acts may later undergo genuine moral transformation, raising questions about the relationship between their earlier and later selves. If people can change fundamentally, then holding someone responsible for past evil acts may be unjust if they no longer possess the same moral character that produced those acts. Conversely, if moral responsibility persists across character change, then it must be grounded in something more stable than the psychological continuity that compatibilism typically requires. The problem of moral luck intersects with free will concerns in complex ways that affect judgments about evil. Even if agents possess free will in some robust sense, the actual consequences of their choices depend partly on factors beyond their control, making judgments about the degree of evil in their acts depend on lucky or unlucky circumstances. Similarly, the opportunities for evil that agents encounter result partly from circumstances beyond their control, raising questions about whether agents who face greater temptations can be held to the same standards as those who face fewer moral challenges. Free will theories must explain how moral responsibility interacts with luck factors in ways that preserve appropriate degrees of accountability without ignoring the role of circumstances in shaping moral behavior. The collective dimension of evil actions creates additional problems for individual free will and moral responsibility. Many of the most significant evil acts occur through collective action where individual contributions are small but cumulative effects are enormous, making it difficult to assign appropriate responsibility to particular agents. Each individual may freely choose their level of participation, but the overall outcome depends on the choices of countless others in ways that no single agent can control or predict. This suggests that individual free will may be insufficient for understanding collective evil, requiring supplementary frameworks that can address shared responsibility and institutional agency beyond individual moral psychology. Part 10. The Epistemology of Evil Recognition. Our ability to recognize evil acts and evil persons raises fundamental epistemological questions about how we gain moral knowledge and what justifies confident judgments about complex moral phenomena. Evil recognition appears to require both factual knowledge about actions and consequences and evaluative knowledge about moral standards. Yet, the relationship between these types of knowledge remains unclear and contentious. Furthermore, evil recognition often occurs immediately through emotional and intuitive responses rather than through careful, rational deliberation, suggesting that moral epistemology may differ fundamentally from empirical knowledge acquisition. However, immediate moral judgments prove fallible and culturally variable in ways that challenge their reliability as sources of genuine moral knowledge. The phenomenology of evil recognition suggests a complex interaction between cognitive and affective processes that resists reduction to either purely rational or purely emotional responses. When encountering paradigm cases of evil like unprovoked cruelty or systematic oppression, people typically experience immediate negative emotional reactions accompanied by confident moral judgments that the actions are wrong. These responses appear to involve recognition of moral facts rather than mere expression of personal preferences or cultural conditioning, yet they occur too quickly and automatically to involve extensive rational reflection. This suggests either that moral knowledge can be immediate and intuitive, or that apparent moral recognition actually involves non-cognitive responses that we mistakenly interpret as knowledge claims. Testing moral intuitions against philosophical thought experiments reveals systematic patterns of judgment that support their cognitive content while also exposing their limitations. Most people consistently judge intentional harm as worse than merely foreseen harm, harm caused by action as worse than harm allowed through inaction, and harm to identified individuals as worse than statistically equivalent harm to unidentified people. These patterns suggest underlying moral principles that guide intuitive judgment, providing evidence that moral responses track genuine moral features rather than arbitrary preferences. Yet the same intuitions that seem reliable in simple cases often generate inconsistent or problematic judgments in complex cases involving multiple competing moral considerations. The cultural variability of evil recognition creates challenges for claims about universal moral knowledge, while also revealing possible cross-cultural convergence on core cases. Practices that some cultures condemn as evil, such as certain forms of punishment, sexual behavior, or religious expression, other cultures consider acceptable or even obligatory. This variation suggests that evil recognition depends partly on culturally specific moral frameworks rather than pure universal moral insight. However, certain core cases like unprovoked violence against innocents appear to be condemned across virtually all human cultures, suggesting either universal moral knowledge or universal human psychological responses that create apparent moral convergence. The relationship between moral testimony and first-hand moral judgment raises questions about whether evil recognition requires direct experience or can be transmitted through reliable sources. We often accept moral judgments from trusted authorities, historical accounts, or moral experts without directly investigating the relevant cases ourselves. Yet, moral testimony seems epistemically weaker than empirical testimony because moral knowledge appears to require personal evaluation and commitment in ways that factual knowledge does not. This creates dilemmas about how to respond to reports of evil when we lack direct access to relevant evidence and must rely on the moral judgments of others who may have different moral frameworks or questionable reliability. The temporal dimension of evil recognition reveals how moral judgments can change as we gain additional information or moral insight, while raising questions about whether earlier or later judgments are more reliable. Historical figures once widely admired are now often condemned for practices their contemporaries considered acceptable, suggesting either moral progress in recognition or inappropriate application of contemporary moral standards to different historical contexts. Similarly, individuals often revise their moral judgments about particular cases as they gain life experience or exposure to different perspectives, but it remains unclear whether such revisions represent increased moral knowledge or mere change in moral opinion. The epistemology of evil must explain how to adjudicate between competing moral judgments across time without simply privileging current views as automatically superior. The problem of moral disagreement among apparently competent moral judges challenges the reliability of evil recognition as a source of moral knowledge. Thoughtful, experienced, and morally serious people often disagree about whether particular actions or policies should be condemned as evil, even when they possess the same factual information about relevant cases. Such disagreement is less problematic for empirical knowledge, where we can often resolve disputes through additional evidence or improved methods, but moral disagreement seems to persist even with perfect, factual knowledge. This suggests either that moral knowledge is impossible, that some apparent moral experts are systematically mistaken, or that moral truth is more complex and context-dependent than simple realist approaches assume. The role of imagination in evil recognition raises questions about the relationship between moral knowledge and our ability to understand experiences we have not directly encountered. Recognizing evil often requires understanding what it would be like to experience various forms of harm, oppression, or degradation that we may never have personally undergone. This imaginative component of moral judgment suggests that evil recognition depends partly on empathetic and imaginative capacities, rather than purely on rational analysis of objective moral facts. Yet imagination can be unreliable and biased, leading to systematic errors in moral judgment when we fail to accurately understand others' experiences or project our own concerns inappropriately onto different situations. The relationship between evil recognition and moral motivation creates additional epistemological puzzles about the connection between moral knowledge and moral action. Genuine recognition of evil seems to involve not just intellectual acknowledgement that certain actions are wrong, but also appropriate emotional and motivational responses like indignation, concern for victims, and commitment to prevention or resistance. This suggests that moral knowledge may be essentially practical rather than purely theoretical, requiring integration of cognitive, affective, and motivational elements in ways that distinguish it from other forms of knowledge. However, this connection between moral knowledge and motivation creates problems for moral epistemology if psychological incapacity for appropriate motivation undermines the possibility of genuine moral knowledge, even when intellectual understanding remains intact. The justification of confident moral judgments about evil faces particular challenges when these judgments have serious, practical consequences for punishment, social policy, or interpersonal relationships. Moral epistemology must explain when we are justified in acting on moral beliefs despite moral disagreement, epistemic limitations, and the possibility of error in cases where mistakes can cause significant harm. This practical dimension of moral epistemology suggests that moral knowledge claims may be held to different standards than purely theoretical knowledge claims, requiring not just truth, but also sufficient certainty to justify potentially harmful practical applications. The epistemology of evil must therefore address not only how we can know moral facts, but also when our moral knowledge is sufficiently reliable to ground serious practical decisions about human welfare and social organization. Part 11. Moral emotions and the recognition of evil. The relationship between moral emotions like indignation, horror, and disgust and the recognition of evil presents fundamental questions about whether these emotions constitute genuine moral knowledge or merely psychological reactions that accompany but do not ground moral judgment. When witnessing acts of cruelty, most people experience immediate emotional responses that seem to reveal moral facts about the wrongness of the actions, rather than simply expressing personal attitudes toward them. Yet these same emotions can be triggered by morally irrelevant factors like cultural taboos, aesthetic preferences, or evolutionary psychological mechanisms that have no clear connection to genuine moral considerations. This creates a dilemma about whether moral emotions should be trusted as guides to moral truth or dismissed as unreliable psychological phenomena that contaminate genuine moral reasoning. The cognitive content of moral emotions requires careful analysis to determine what information they might provide about evil acts and evil agents. Indignation appears to involve not just negative feeling, but also evaluative judgment that someone has acted wrongly and deserves blame or punishment. Similarly, moral horror seems to combine emotional revulsion with recognition that certain actions violate fundamental moral constraints in ways that threaten basic human values. If these emotions possess genuine cognitive content, then they might serve as sources of moral knowledge rather than mere expressions of psychological states. But determining their cognitive reliability requires examining whether their judgmental content tracks genuine moral facts or merely reflects contingent features of human psychology. Testing moral emotions against cases involving cultural variation reveals both their potential universality and their apparent relativity. Certain forms of unprovoked violence and cruelty appear to trigger similar emotional responses across different cultural contexts, suggesting possible universal moral emotions that reflect shared human moral capacities. However, many practices that trigger strong moral emotions in some cultures, such as certain dietary practices, sexual behaviors, or religious rituals, fail to produce similar responses in other cultures or even produce opposite reactions. This pattern suggests either that some moral emotions track universal moral facts while others reflect cultural conditioning, or that all moral emotions are culturally relative, but some happen to coincide across cultures due to shared evolutionary or social factors. The relationship between moral emotions and moral reasoning creates questions about their proper role in moral judgment and decision-making. Some philosophical approaches treat emotions as mere motivational forces that should be controlled by rational moral principles, while others argue that emotions provide essential moral information that pure reasoning cannot access. When moral emotions conflict with rational moral principles, as when disgust leads to condemnation of harmless behaviors or when sympathy leads to unfair partiality, we need criteria for determining which should take priority. Neither pure emotivism that reduces moral judgment to emotional expression, nor pure rationalism that dismisses emotional input seems adequate for handling complex moral cases, where reasoning and emotion provide different guidance. The temporal dynamics of moral emotions raise questions about their reliability as sources of information about evil. Initial emotional reactions to moral cases often differ from considered judgments reached after reflection, discussion, and exposure to additional information about relevant circumstances. Someone might initially feel outrage about an action, but later recognize that contextual factors make the action understandable or even praiseworthy, or conversely might dismiss something as harmless, but later recognize its serious moral significance. This suggests either that initial emotional reactions are unreliable guides to moral truth, or that reflection can corrupt genuine moral insight by introducing irrelevant considerations that override appropriate emotional responses. The calibration problem for moral emotions reveals systematic biases that affect their reliability as guides to evil recognition. People tend to experience stronger moral emotions toward harms caused by identifiable individuals than toward statistically equivalent harms caused by abstract systems or policies, even when the latter may be more morally significant. Similarly, moral emotions appear to be influenced by factors like physical proximity, temporal proximity, and social similarity that seem morally irrelevant but powerfully affect emotional intensity. These biases suggest that moral emotions may be better understood as evolved psychological mechanisms designed for small-scale social cooperation, rather than as reliable guides to moral facts in complex modern social environments. The relationship between moral emotions and empathy creates additional complications for their role in evil recognition. Empathy allows us to understand and share the emotions of others, potentially providing crucial information about how actions affect victims and what makes certain treatments harmful or degrading. Yet empathy appears to be selective and biased toward those who are similar to us or psychologically salient, creating systematic blind spots in moral judgment that may obscure genuine evil or create false perceptions of evil where none exists. Furthermore, some forms of evil may specifically target empathetic responses, manipulating them to facilitate harmful actions or prevent appropriate moral condemnation. The social dimension of moral emotions reveals how they function not just as individual responses to evil, but as forms of moral communication and social coordination. Expressing moral indignation or horror serves to communicate moral judgments to others, coordinate social responses to wrongdoing, and reinforce shared moral standards within communities. This social function may be more important than any individual epistemic role that moral emotions play, suggesting that their value lies in facilitating moral cooperation rather than providing moral knowledge. However, this social function can also corrupt moral emotions when they become tools for manipulation, scapegoating, or the enforcement of unjust social hierarchies rather than genuine responses to moral wrongdoing. The intensity problem for moral emotions raises questions about their proportionality to the moral significance of different types of evil. Moral emotions often respond more strongly to vivid, immediate, or personally relevant forms of wrongdoing than to abstract or distant evils that may be objectively more serious. This suggests that emotional intensity may be a poor guide to moral priority, leading to misallocation of moral attention and resources toward less significant problems that happen to trigger strong emotional responses. Yet the alternative of discounting emotional intensity in favor of abstract moral calculation risks losing important information about what makes certain actions particularly harmful or degrading from the perspective of those who experience them. The educability of moral emotions suggests that they may be neither purely natural responses nor completely arbitrary cultural constructions, but rather natural capacities that can be shaped and refined through moral education and experience. People can learn to feel appropriate moral emotions toward previously unrecognized forms of evil, and to moderate emotional responses that prove unreliable or disproportionate. This plasticity provides hope that moral emotions can be improved as sources of moral guidance. But it also raises questions about what counts as improvement and whether there are objective standards for calibrating emotional responses to moral facts. The educability of moral emotions may be crucial for addressing new forms of evil that arise through technological change or social development, but were not present in the evolutionary environments that shaped our natural emotional capacities. Part 12. The relationship between evil and suffering. The conceptual relationship between evil and suffering appears both intimate and problematic, since suffering seems necessary for most paradigm cases of evil, while also being insufficient to constitute evil in itself. Natural disasters cause immense suffering without involving moral agency, while some evil acts like betrayal or humiliation may cause relatively little physical suffering, but still strike us as seriously wrong. This suggests that evil requires more than mere suffering, perhaps suffering caused by moral agents, or suffering that violates dignity, or suffering that serves no constructive purpose. However, each proposed refinement faces counterexamples and logical difficulties that reveal the complexity of connecting suffering to moral evaluation in systematic ways. The sufficiency problem for suffering-based accounts of evil emerges immediately when considering cases of suffering that do not appear to involve moral wrongdoing. Medical procedures often cause significant suffering, but serve beneficial purposes that justify the pain involved, making them morally praiseworthy rather than evil. Similarly, appropriate punishment, necessary self-defense and constructive criticism may cause suffering to their targets while remaining morally justified or even required. This suggests that suffering alone cannot determine evil. We need additional criteria involving purpose, justification, or the relationship between suffering and broader moral considerations. Examining the necessity of suffering for evil reveals cases that challenge simple, suffering-based accounts while supporting more complex relationships between evil and harm. Someone who attempts murder but fails due to circumstances beyond their control seems to perform an evil act despite causing no actual suffering to their intended victim. Similarly, successful deception may cause no immediate suffering if the victim never discovers the lie, yet the deception appears to wrong the victim by violating their autonomy and dignity. These cases suggest that evil may depend on factors like intention, character, or the violation of moral relationships that can exist independently of actual suffering, though they typically involve the risk or intention of causing suffering. The quality versus quantity problem for suffering in evil acts raises questions about how different types of suffering should be weighed against each other in moral evaluation. Physical pain, emotional distress, loss of opportunity, violation of dignity, and destruction of relationships represent different types of suffering that resist simple quantitative comparison. Someone who causes severe physical pain may seem less evil than someone who destroys another's reputation or corrupts their moral character, even if the physical pain is more intense, suggesting that the moral significance of suffering depends partly on its type, rather than just its quantity. However, developing principled ways to compare different types of suffering requires controversial assumptions about human nature, moral priorities, and the relative importance of different aspects of human flourishing. Testing suffering-based approaches against cases involving collective and institutional evil reveals additional complexities in connecting individual suffering to moral evaluation. Systems that cause widespread suffering through their normal operation may be more evil than individual acts that cause intense suffering to particular victims. Yet the diffuse nature of systemic suffering makes it difficult to assess using frameworks designed for evaluating individual actions. Furthermore, the temporal distribution of suffering matters morally. Systems that cause moderate ongoing suffering may be worse than those causing intense but brief suffering. But temporal weighting introduces additional complications about discounting, uncertainty, and the rights of future generations. These cases suggest that evil evaluation requires frameworks that can handle both individual and collective dimensions of suffering in integrated ways. The relationship between intended suffering and actual suffering creates paradoxes for connecting evil to suffering outcomes. Someone who intends to cause great suffering but achieves only minor harm seems less evil from a consequentialist perspective than someone who intends minor harm but accidentally causes catastrophic suffering. Yet our intuitive judgments often reverse this ordering, treating malicious intent as more evil than unfortunate consequences, suggesting that evil may depend more on what agents try to accomplish than on what they actually achieve. This creates tensions between desert-based approaches that focus on moral character and consequence-based approaches that focus on actual outcomes, with no clear way to adjudicate between them when they conflict. The problem of justified suffering reveals deep disagreements about when causing suffering can be not merely permissible, but morally required. Retributivist theories of punishment argue that wrongdoers deserve to suffer as payment for their crimes, making the infliction of suffering on them intrinsically good, rather than merely instrumentally justified. Similarly, Some approaches to distributive justice suggest that those who benefit from unjust systems deserve to lose their advantages, even if this causes them significant suffering. These positions treat the suffering of wrongdoers as positively valuable rather than merely acceptable as a side effect of pursuing other goods. But they face charges of cruelty and inhumane treatment that seem to make suffering intrinsically evil, regardless of desert. The experiential dimension of suffering raises questions about whose perspective should determine whether particular experiences count as genuine suffering for purposes of moral evaluation. Some people report that experiences others would consider intensely painful, such as extreme physical challenges or ascetic practices, are actually sources of meaning and satisfaction rather than genuine suffering. Conversely, some people experience as deeply harmful treatments that others consider minor or even beneficial, such as certain forms of criticism or social pressure. This subjectivity of suffering experience creates problems for objective moral evaluation, since acts cannot be condemned as evil for causing suffering unless there are objective standards for determining when suffering actually occurs. The prevention versus alleviation distinction creates additional complications for suffering-based approaches to evil evaluation. Someone who prevents future suffering by causing present suffering, such as a parent who disciplines a child or a society that imprisons dangerous criminals, seems to be minimizing overall suffering while still causing particular instances of suffering. Similarly, someone who alleviates present suffering in ways that increase future suffering, such as providing addictive substances to people in pain, may be increasing overall suffering while reducing particular instances of suffering. These cases require temporal and probabilistic calculations that introduce uncertainty and disagreement about consequences, making it difficult to determine whether particular acts increase or decrease suffering overall. The measurement problem for suffering in moral evaluation reveals fundamental difficulties in developing precise accounts of how suffering contributes to evil. Suffering appears to be multidimensional, involving physical, emotional, social, and spiritual aspects that resist reduction to common metrics. Furthermore, the moral significance of suffering may depend not just on its intensity and duration, but also on factors like meaning, choice, distribution, and relationship to human agency that complicate simple utilitarian calculations. Without reliable ways to measure and compare suffering across different contexts and types, suffering-based approaches to evil remain necessarily imprecise and controversial in their practical applications to complex moral cases. Part 13. Virtue Ethics and the Character of Evil. Virtue ethics approaches evil through the lens of character rather than actions or consequences, treating evil as a manifestation of vicious character traits that corrupt human flourishing and prevent the realization of human excellence. According to this framework, someone is evil not primarily because they perform particular harmful actions, but because they possess stable dispositions towards vice that systematically distort their responses to moral situations. This character-based approach promises to capture the unity and persistence of evil across different contexts, while explaining why we judge some people as evil persons rather than merely as performers of evil acts. However, virtue-based approaches face serious difficulties in defining vices precisely, explaining moral responsibility for character traits, and handling cases where virtuous character traits conflict with each other or lead to harmful outcomes. The unity of virtue thesis creates logical problems for virtue ethics approaches to evil by suggesting that genuine virtue requires excellence in all moral dimensions simultaneously. If virtues are interconnected such that possessing one virtue genuinely requires possessing all others, Then vice should similarly be unified, making partial evil or mixed character impossible. Yet empirical observation reveals that people often display genuine virtues in some domains while exhibiting serious vices in others. Someone might be consistently honest and compassionate, but also cowardly and proud. The virtue approach must either abandon the unity thesis and explain how virtues and vices can exist independently, or defend the thesis and explain away apparent cases of mixed character as involving only apparent rather than genuine virtues. The development problem for character-based evil raises questions about moral responsibility for traits that form gradually through processes that extend beyond individual control. Character traits result from complex interactions between genetic predispositions, early childhood experiences, cultural influences, and countless individual choices over extended periods of time. While people make particular choices that contribute to character formation, the overall trajectory of character development depends heavily on factors beyond their control, especially during formative periods when moral agency is not fully developed. This creates difficulties for holding people responsible for evil character traits that may have been substantially determined before they possessed full moral agency, yet continue to influence their behavior throughout their adult lives. Testing virtue ethics against cases involving situational influences on behavior reveals tensions between character-based explanations of evil and empirical evidence about the power of circumstances to influence moral behavior. Social psychology experiments demonstrate that ordinary people can be induced to perform harmful actions through situational pressures like authority commands, peer pressure, or institutional roles, even when these actions conflict with their apparent moral character. These findings suggest that behavior may depend more on situational factors than on stable character traits, challenging the virtue ethics assumption that evil acts primarily reflect evil character rather than evil circumstances. Virtue theorists must either explain why situational influences do not undermine character-based moral evaluation or revise their approach to accommodate the power of situations in shaping moral behavior. The specification problem for vices creates difficulties in determining which character traits count as genuinely evil versus merely imperfect or unfortunate. Traditional vice lists include traits like pride, greed, wrath, and cruelty, but these categories are often vague and culturally variable in ways that make precise moral evaluation difficult. Furthermore, many apparent vices may be virtues in inappropriate contexts. Courage can become recklessness, generosity can become enabling, and justice can become rigid inflexibility when taken to extremes or applied inappropriately. This suggests that vices may not be intrinsic character traits, but rather virtues that are misdirected, excessive, or contextually inappropriate, complicating simple, character-based approaches to evil evaluation. The relationship between evil character and evil actions creates logical puzzles about the priority of character versus behavior in moral evaluation. Virtue ethics suggests that actions are evil because they flow from evil character, but we typically infer evil character from observing evil actions, creating potential circularity in moral judgment. Someone who performs consistently harmful actions over time appears to have evil character, but this inference assumes that the actions genuinely reflect character rather than circumstances, compulsion, or other factors that might excuse or mitigate character-based judgments. Breaking this circularity requires independent criteria for identifying evil character. But such criteria prove difficult to develop without relying on patterns of behavior that return us to the original problem. The moral luck problem affects virtue ethics approaches to evil through questions about responsibility for character traits that result partly from factors beyond agents' control. Someone born with genetic predispositions toward aggression and raised in violent environments faces different challenges in developing virtuous character than someone with different natural endowments and social circumstances. If virtue and vice depend partly on natural and social luck, then character-based moral evaluation may be unfair in ways that undermine its legitimacy as a basis for moral judgment. Virtue theorists must either explain how agents can overcome luck factors through moral effort, or accept that character-based evaluation is inevitably contaminated by morally irrelevant factors. The pluralism problem for virtue ethics emerges when different virtuous character traits conflict with each other in particular situations, forcing agents to choose between competing moral excellences. Honesty might require revealing information that compassion suggests should be concealed, or justice might demand punishment that mercy suggests should be forgiven. These conflicts create situations where any action appears to involve some moral failing, suggesting that perfectly virtuous character may be impossible in practice even if it remains valuable as an ideal. The problem becomes more acute for evil character, since vices might sometimes conflict in ways that prevent agents from being completely vicious, creating mixed character that resists simple moral evaluation through virtue frameworks. The cultural relativity of virtue concepts creates challenges for virtue-based approaches to evil that seek universal moral truths rather than merely culturally relative evaluations. Different cultures emphasize different virtues and define the same virtue terms differently, leading to systematic disagreement about which character traits should be considered virtuous versus vicious. What some cultures treat as appropriately assertive, others condemn as aggressively domineering, and what some cultures praise as properly respectful, others criticize as submissively weak. These cultural differences suggest either that virtue concepts are inevitably relative to particular social contexts, or that cross-cultural moral evaluation requires controversial claims about which cultural approaches to virtue are superior to others. The relationship between individual virtue and social institutions raises questions about how character-based approaches to evil should handle collective and systemic forms of wrongdoing. Evil institutions may corrupt the character of individuals who participate in them, but they may also result from the aggregation of individually minor character flaws in ways that create systematic harm exceeding what any individual intends or controls. Furthermore, virtuous individuals may be powerless to prevent institutional evil, or may find that their individual virtue is ineffective in contexts where systemic factors determine outcomes regardless of individual character. This suggests that character-based approaches to evil need supplementation with institutional and structural analyses that can address forms of wrongdoing that transcend individual moral psychology while remaining connected to questions about human character and moral development. Part 14. Collective Evil and Institutional Responsibility. The phenomenon of collective evil challenges individualistic approaches to moral philosophy by revealing how groups, institutions and social systems can perpetrate systematic wrongdoing that exceeds what any individual member intends, controls, or could accomplish alone. Collective evil often emerges through the interaction of individually minor moral failures, structural incentives that reward harmful behavior, and diffusion of responsibility that prevents anyone from being held fully accountable for group outcomes. This creates logical problems for traditional moral frameworks that focus on individual agency, since collective evil appears to involve genuine moral wrongdoing that cannot be reduced to the sum of individual moral failures without remainder. Yet, Extending moral concepts like responsibility, blame, and punishment to collective entities raises fundamental questions about the nature of group agency and the conditions under which organizations can be held morally accountable. The problem of group agency requires determining whether collective entities possess the kinds of mental states and decision-making capacities that ground individual moral responsibility. Individual moral responsibility typically presupposes belief, desire, intention, and rational reflection that enable agents to understand moral requirements and choose how to respond to them. Groups and institutions appear to have decision-making procedures, organizational goals, and collective beliefs embodied in their policies and practices, but it remains unclear whether these institutional features constitute genuine agency comparable to individual agency. If groups lack genuine agency, then attributing moral responsibility to them involves problematic anthropomorphization. But if they possess genuine agency, we need accounts of how collective mental states relate to the mental states of individual members. Testing theories of collective responsibility against cases involving corporate wrongdoing reveals the complexity of assigning moral accountability across organizational hierarchies. When a corporation causes environmental damage through systematic cost-cutting and regulatory avoidance, responsibility appears distributed among executives who set policies, managers who implement them, employees who carry out specific tasks, and shareholders who benefit from profits. Yet no individual may fully intend or control the harmful outcome, and each person's contribution may be minor relative to the overall harm caused. This distributed responsibility creates problems for punishment and compensation that require identifying specific parties who should bear costs. Yet simple aggregation of individual contributions may miss emergent properties of organizational action that exceed individual moral psychology. The temporal dimension of collective evil creates additional complications for moral assessment and response. Institutional practices often persist across generations of participants, creating continuity of harmful effects, even as individual membership changes completely over time. Current members of institutions may inherit practices they did not design and consequences of past decisions they did not make, raising questions about their responsibility for ongoing institutional harm. Similarly, victims of collective evil may suffer consequences long after the original perpetrators have died or moved on, creating problems for restorative justice that requires identifying appropriate parties to bear responsibility for repair and compensation. The emergence problem for collective evil reveals how individual actions that appear morally acceptable in isolation can combine to create systematic harm that exceeds anyone's intention or control. Market transactions that are individually voluntary and mutually beneficial may collectively generate environmental degradation, economic inequality, or social instability that no one desires or chooses. Similarly, individual career decisions, consumption choices, and political actions may contribute to collective patterns that undermine social cooperation and human flourishing, even when each individual acts reasonably given their circumstances and information. This suggests that collective evil may be an emergent property of social systems, rather than simply the aggregation of individual evil acts, requiring different frameworks for moral evaluation and social response. The complicity problem arises when individuals participate in collective evil without directly intending or controlling harmful outcomes, but while benefiting from systems that produce such outcomes. Citizens of wealthy nations benefit from economic and political systems that may contribute to global poverty and environmental degradation, making them potentially complicit in collective harm, even if their individual contributions are minor. and their intentions are benevolent. Similarly, consumers, employees, and investors may be implicated in institutional practices they oppose but feel powerless to change, creating moral dilemmas about the extent of individual responsibility for collective outcomes. Determining appropriate degrees of complicity requires balancing individual agency and choice against systemic constraints and collective action problems that limit what individuals can accomplish alone. The prevention problem for collective evil involves coordination challenges that make it difficult for individuals to address systematic wrongdoing, even when they recognize its existence and moral significance. Someone who withdraws from harmful institutional practices may simply be replaced by others, making their individual action ineffective, while potentially sacrificing their ability to influence institutional change from within. Collective action to reform institutions requires coordination among multiple parties who may have different interests, beliefs, and levels of commitment, creating free-rider problems where everyone benefits if others act, but individuals have incentives to avoid costly participation themselves. These coordination problems suggest that addressing collective evil may require institutional solutions and social mechanisms that can overcome individual rational choice limitations rather than relying primarily on individual moral choice. The punishment problem for collective evil raises questions about how to respond appropriately to wrongdoing when individual participants deserve different degrees of blame and punishment. Collective punishment that treats all members of harmful groups equally seems unfair to those who resisted or played minor roles, while individual punishment that ignores collective dimensions may be insufficient to address systematic harm and prevent recurrence. Furthermore, some collective entities like corporations or governments may survive changes in membership, making it unclear whether organizational punishment affects the right parties or simply shifts costs to innocent parties who had no involvement in original wrongdoing. Developing appropriate responses to collective evil requires frameworks that can address both individual justice concerns and collective prevention needs without sacrificing either to the other. The reform problem involves determining how to change institutions and social practices that generate collective evil while preserving beneficial aspects of social cooperation and organization. Most institutions serve some legitimate purposes even when they also produce harmful side effects, creating trade-offs between preventing specific forms of collective evil and maintaining social functions that people value and depend upon. Furthermore, institutional reform faces implementation problems when those with power to make changes benefit from existing arrangements, and collective action problems when reform requires coordination among parties with different interests and beliefs. This suggests that addressing collective evil requires sophisticated understanding of social systems and change processes rather than simple moral condemnation. But such understanding may exceed what moral philosophy can provide without assistance from empirical social sciences. The relationship between collective evil and individual moral development raises questions about how participation in harmful institutions affects individual character and moral responsibility over time. People who work within evil systems may gradually accommodate to harmful practices through psychological mechanisms that protect them from cognitive dissonance and moral distress, potentially corrupting their individual moral judgment and character. Conversely, individuals may maintain moral integrity within corrupt systems through forms of resistance, moral distance, or compartmentalization that preserve their individual virtue while limiting their complicity in collective harm. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for moral evaluation of individual participants in collective evil and for developing strategies to prevent institutional corruption of individual moral agency. Part 15. The Problem of Moral Monsters. The concept of moral monsters, individuals who appear to lack normal human moral capacities entirely and commit extreme evil without apparent remorse, empathy, or moral understanding, challenges fundamental assumptions about human nature, moral development, and the possibility of moral education and reform. Cases like serial killers who torture victims for pleasure, dictators who order genocide with apparent satisfaction, or individuals who systematically exploit and abuse others without any sign of moral concern, seem to represent a qualitatively different kind of evil than ordinary moral failure. These cases raise questions about whether moral monsters possess the same moral status as other human beings, whether they can be held responsible in the same ways as ordinary moral agents, and whether their existence reveals fundamental limitations in moral theory and practice. However, the moral monster concept faces serious logical difficulties in defining the boundary between extreme evil and ordinary moral failure, explaining how moral monsters develop while preserving human dignity, and determining appropriate responses to individuals who appear to be beyond moral reach. The definitional problem for moral monsters requires specifying what distinguishes extreme evil from merely serious moral failure without relying on circular reasoning or arbitrary thresholds. Simply defining moral monsters as those who commit the most heinous crimes conflates moral and legal categories while failing to identify the psychological or moral characteristics that make certain individuals qualitatively different from ordinary wrongdoers. Alternatively, defining moral monsters by their apparent lack of normal moral emotions like guilt, empathy, or remorse faces the problem that these internal states are difficult to verify and may be present but overridden by other factors rather than genuinely absent. The definition must capture what makes certain individuals seem fundamentally different from ordinary moral agents without presupposing controversial theories about human nature or moral psychology. Testing the moral monster concept against actual cases reveals both its intuitive appeal and its problematic implications for human dignity and moral responsibility. Individuals who commit extreme crimes often display histories of severe abuse, mental illness, brain dysfunction, or other factors that suggest their evil behavior results from developmental trauma rather than freely chosen moral corruption. If moral monsters are made rather than born, then they deserve treatment and rehabilitation rather than simple condemnation. But if their evil character is irreversible, then they may require permanent containment that treats them more like dangerous animals than moral agents. Neither conclusion seems satisfactory. The first may ignore legitimate concerns about public safety and victim rights, while the second may violate human dignity by excluding some humans from the moral community entirely. The responsibility problem for moral monsters involves determining whether individuals who appear to lack normal moral capacities can be held responsible for their actions in the same ways as ordinary moral agents. Moral responsibility typically requires that agents understand moral requirements and possess the ability to conform their behavior to moral norms. But moral monsters may lack precisely these capacities. If they cannot understand why their actions are wrong, or cannot control their behavior through moral considerations, then holding them responsible may be as inappropriate as blaming someone for actions they perform while sleepwalking or during psychotic episodes. Yet the extreme harm caused by moral monsters and their apparent rationality in other domains suggest they retain enough agency to ground some form of moral accountability, even if it differs from ordinary responsibility attributions. The development problem asks how moral monsters emerge from ordinary human developmental processes, while preserving assumptions about fundamental human moral equality and potential. If all humans are born with similar moral capacities, then moral monsters must result from developmental failures that could theoretically be prevented through appropriate intervention and support. This suggests that moral monsters represent failures of society, family, or individual development rather than intrinsic evil character, making them victims as well as perpetrators and calling for therapeutic rather than purely punitive responses. However, this developmental account faces difficulties in explaining why some individuals who experience similar developmental trauma do not become moral monsters, and why therapeutic interventions often prove ineffective for extreme cases, even when applied extensively and skillfully. The treatment problem involves determining appropriate responses to moral monsters that balance public safety, victim rights, human dignity, and possibilities for moral reform. Traditional punishment may be inappropriate if moral monsters lack the moral understanding necessary to appreciate the moral significance of their punishment or learn from it. Therapeutic intervention may be ineffective if moral monsters lack the emotional and motivational capacities necessary for moral development, while preventive detention may violate rights if it involves punishing individuals for future crimes they have not yet committed. Each approach faces moral objections that reflect deeper tensions between treating moral monsters as moral agents, who can be held responsible, versus treating them as individuals with disabilities that limit their moral capacities. The philosophical implications of moral monsters challenge foundational assumptions in moral theory about human nature, moral development, and the scope of moral consideration. If moral monsters exist as genuine natural phenomena, rather than merely social constructions or misunderstandings, they suggest that human moral capacity may be more variable and fragile than many moral theories assume. This variability poses problems for universalistic moral theories that attempt to derive moral principles from shared human nature, since moral monsters may not share the psychological capacities that ground these derivations. Conversely, if moral monsters are better understood as products of social construction or theoretical confusion, then their apparent existence may reveal problematic assumptions about evil and moral agency rather than genuine facts about human moral psychology. The social response problem involves determining how societies should organize their institutions and practices to address moral monsters while preserving commitment to human dignity and moral equality. Legal systems must balance protecting society from dangerous individuals with preserving due process rights and avoiding discriminatory treatment based on psychological characteristics rather than criminal actions. Mental health systems must address individuals whose problems may exceed therapeutic capacities while maintaining professional commitment to patient welfare and recovery potential. These institutional challenges reflect deeper philosophical problems about the relationship between individual moral status and social response that cannot be resolved through purely theoretical analysis without empirical information about effectiveness and consequences of different approaches. The moral education implications of moral monsters raise questions about the limits of moral development and the conditions under which moral education can be effective. If some individuals lack the emotional, cognitive, or motivational capacities necessary for moral learning, then moral education must be targeted to those who can benefit rather than applied universally. This selective approach conflicts with educational ideals about equal opportunity and human development potential, while universal approaches may waste resources on individuals who cannot benefit while failing to provide intensive intervention for those who need it most. Furthermore, early identification of potential moral monsters raises ethical problems about labeling, self-fulfilling prophecies, and discrimination that may create the very problems that intervention seeks to prevent. The concept of moral monsters ultimately forces consideration of the boundaries of moral community and the conditions under which individuals qualify for full moral status versus some diminished form of moral consideration. This boundary-drawing process has dangerous historical precedents in exclusions based on race, religion, or mental capacity that serve to legitimate oppression rather than respond appropriately to genuine moral differences. Yet refusing to acknowledge real differences in moral capacity may prevent appropriate responses to extreme cases while failing to protect vulnerable individuals from those who would exploit their moral consideration. The challenge is developing frameworks that can acknowledge variation in moral capacities without creating hierarchies that violate human equality or provide justification for oppressive social arrangements. Part 16. Evil and Moral Development Across the Lifespan. The temporal dimension of moral development creates fundamental questions about how evil character emerges, whether it can be prevented through appropriate intervention, and when individuals become fully responsible for their moral failures versus remaining partially excused due to incomplete development. Children who commit harmful acts appear less evil than adults who perform identical actions, suggesting that full moral responsibility requires developmental achievements that emerge gradually rather than being present from birth. Yet some children display persistent patterns of cruelty, manipulation, and callous disregard for others that seem to predict adult evil behavior, raising questions about early intervention and the possibility of moral corruption that occurs before agents develop full moral agency. Understanding evil requires examining how moral capacities develop over time and how developmental processes can go wrong in ways that produce systematic moral failure. The relationship between moral understanding and moral motivation creates developmental puzzles about whether children and adolescents who understand moral rules but fail to follow them should be considered evil or merely immature. Young people often demonstrate sophisticated understanding of moral principles while simultaneously engaging in behavior that violates these principles, suggesting that moral development involves more than acquiring moral knowledge. The capacity for moral motivation may develop separately from and more slowly than moral understanding, creating periods where individuals know what they should do but lack sufficient motivational resources to act accordingly. This developmental gap raises questions about responsibility and blame during transitional periods when moral agency is partially but not fully developed. Testing developmental accounts of evil against cases involving childhood trauma and adverse experiences reveals complex interactions between environmental influences and individual moral development. Children who experience abuse, neglect, or exposure to violence show increased rates of later aggressive and antisocial behavior, suggesting that evil may result from developmental disruption rather than intrinsic moral failure. However, many individuals who experience severe trauma do not develop evil character, while some who have supportive upbringings still engage in systematic wrongdoing, indicating that environmental factors alone cannot explain the emergence of evil. The interaction between individual vulnerabilities and environmental risks appears more complex than simple causal models can capture, requiring developmental theories that can accommodate both individual agency and situational influence. The critical periods hypothesis suggests that moral development may be particularly sensitive to environmental influences during specific developmental windows, with disruptions during these periods having lasting effects on moral character. Early attachment relationships may establish foundational capacities for empathy and social connection that later moral development builds upon, making disruptions during infancy and early childhood particularly problematic for moral development. Similarly, adolescent brain development may represent a critical period for moral reasoning and impulse control, suggesting that interventions during this period could be particularly effective in preventing evil character formation. Yet the critical periods hypothesis faces difficulties in specifying exactly when these periods occur and how to design interventions that can effectively address developmental problems during sensitive windows. The stability problem for moral character asks whether evil traits that develop early in life are permanent or can be changed through later moral development and intervention. Some research suggests that personality traits and behavioral patterns become increasingly stable with age, implying that evil character may be difficult to change once it becomes established during childhood or adolescence. This stability could result from neurological development that makes certain patterns of thinking and feeling increasingly automatic, or from social processes that reinforce existing character traits through reputation effects and social selection. However, cases of dramatic moral conversion and successful rehabilitation suggest that even apparently stable evil character may be changeable under appropriate conditions, though such changes may be rare and difficult to achieve reliably. The prevention problem involves determining when and how to intervene in moral development to prevent evil character formation while respecting individual autonomy and family rights. Early intervention might be most effective for preventing evil, but identifying children who are likely to develop evil character requires prediction methods that may stigmatize individuals based on factors beyond their control. Furthermore, effective prevention might require intensive and intrusive interventions that conflict with parental rights and individual privacy, creating trade-offs between preventing future harm and respecting current rights. The intervention must also be effective rather than merely well-intentioned, since ineffective programs may waste resources while providing false confidence that the problem is being addressed. The moral education implications of developmental approaches to evil involve questions about curriculum, methods, and institutional design that can promote positive moral development while preventing moral corruption. Traditional moral education focuses on teaching moral rules and principles, but developmental perspectives suggest that moral character involves emotional, motivational, and behavioral components that require different educational approaches. Character education programs attempt to address these broader dimensions of moral development, but evaluating their effectiveness requires longitudinal studies that can track moral development over extended periods and distinguish genuine character change from temporary behavioral compliance. Furthermore, moral education occurs in social contexts that may either support or undermine educational efforts, requiring coordination between family, school, and community influences that can be difficult to achieve. The cultural dimension of moral development raises questions about whether evil represents universal developmental failure or culturally specific deviation from particular moral traditions. Different cultures emphasize different moral virtues and use different methods for moral education, potentially producing different types of moral character that might appear evil from outside perspectives. However, certain forms of cruelty and callousness appear to be condemned across cultures, suggesting some universal standards for moral development that transcend cultural variation. Understanding the relationship between universal and culturally specific aspects of moral development is crucial for designing educational approaches that can be effective across diverse social contexts while respecting legitimate cultural differences in moral emphasis. The neuroscience of moral development provides new perspectives on evil character formation by revealing the biological processes underlying moral behavior and their sensitivity to environmental influences. Brain imaging studies suggest that moral emotions, reasoning, and behavioral control depend on specific neural systems that develop gradually throughout childhood and adolescence. Disruptions to these developmental processes through injury, illness, or environmental stress may contribute to moral dysfunction in ways that are partially beyond individual control. However, neuroscientific findings must be interpreted carefully to avoid biological determinism that removes moral responsibility entirely, while still acknowledging the biological constraints on moral development that may limit individual agency and choice. The intergenerational transmission of evil raises questions about how evil character patterns persist across family lines and community generations, while leaving room for individual moral agency and choice. Children of parents with serious moral problems show increased rates of moral difficulties themselves, suggesting that evil may be transmitted through genetic, social, or psychological mechanisms that extend beyond individual control. Breaking these intergenerational patterns requires interventions that can address family and community influences, while empowering individuals to develop moral character despite adverse circumstances. Understanding these transmission processes is crucial for developing effective prevention strategies that can interrupt cycles of evil, while respecting individual autonomy and avoiding deterministic assumptions about moral development. Part 17. The Metaphysics of Evil, Existence and Properties. The metaphysical status of evil poses fundamental questions about whether evil exists as an objective feature of reality or merely represents human evaluative responses to morally neutral facts about suffering, harm, and conflict. Moral realists argue that evil possesses genuine objective existence comparable to other natural properties, making moral judgments about evil truth-apt claims that can be correct or incorrect independently of human attitudes and beliefs. Anti-realists contend that evil represents projected human emotions, cultural constructions, or evolutionary psychological mechanisms rather than objective moral facts, making evil discourse expressive or instrumental rather than descriptive of mind-independent reality. This metaphysical disagreement has implications for moral knowledge, moral motivation, and the possibility of moral progress that extend beyond purely theoretical concerns to practical questions about moral education, social policy, and interpersonal relationships. The objectivity problem for evil requires explaining how moral facts could exist independently of human consciousness while remaining accessible to human moral knowledge and motivationally relevant to human action. If evil exists objectively, it must be located somewhere in the natural order and connected to empirical facts in ways that allow investigation and verification of moral claims. Yet evil seems unlike paradigm objective properties like mass or electric charge, since it appears essentially evaluative rather than purely descriptive and seems to depend on conscious experience in ways that purely physical properties do not. Moral realists must either explain how evaluative properties can be genuinely objective or show how evil reduces to non-evaluative natural properties without losing its distinctively moral character. Testing moral realism against cases involving moral disagreement reveals challenges in explaining persistent disputes about evil if moral facts are genuinely objective and accessible to human reasoning. Thoughtful, informed, and morally serious people often disagree about whether particular actions, policies, or individuals should be condemned as evil, even when they possess the same factual information about relevant circumstances. If evil facts are objective and discoverable, Such disagreement suggests either that some parties are systematically mistaken about objective moral facts, or that moral facts are too complex or subtle to be reliably accessed through ordinary human cognitive capacities. Neither explanation seems entirely satisfactory. The first makes moral knowledge surprisingly difficult for competent reasoners, while the second threatens to make moral facts irrelevant to practical moral judgment. The naturalization problem asks whether evil can be identified with or reduced to natural properties that can be studied through empirical investigation without losing its normative force and distinctively moral character. Consequentialist reductions identify evil with properties that cause suffering or prevent flourishing, while virtue-based reductions connect evil to character traits that prevent the realization of human excellence. These naturalistic approaches promise to ground moral facts in objective natural facts while preserving their action-guiding force, but they face the open question argument that asks why we should care about natural properties merely because they are identified with moral ones. If evil just is suffering causation or virtue prevention, then the question remains why we should avoid causing suffering or preventing virtue rather than pursuing other natural goods that might conflict with these moral requirements. The response dependence account attempts to preserve evil's objectivity while acknowledging its essential connection to human evaluative attitudes by analyzing evil in terms of appropriate responses from idealized moral judges. According to this view, actions are evil when they would be condemned by perfectly informed, rational and impartial observers, making evil objective relative to the standards of ideal moral judgment while remaining dependent on conscious evaluative response. This approach avoids crude subjectivism while acknowledging the essential role of moral consciousness in constituting moral facts, but faces challenges in specifying the relevant idealization conditions and explaining why actual human moral judgments should track those of idealized observers. The account must also address whether different idealization procedures would yield conflicting moral verdicts and how to adjudicate between competing conceptions of ideal moral judgment. The moral error theory presents the radical view that moral discourse systematically involves false claims because it presupposes the existence of objective moral facts that do not actually exist. According to this view, statements like torture is evil express beliefs about objective moral properties that nothing actually possesses, making all positive moral claims false, even when they reflect widespread moral agreement. This theory explains moral disagreement by treating it as dispute about non-existent entities comparable to disagreements about fictional characters, while preserving the cognitive content of moral judgment against purely expressivist alternatives. However, the error theory faces practical problems in explaining why we should continue engaging in moral discourse if it involves systematic falsehood, and theoretical problems in accounting for the apparent success of moral practices in coordinating social cooperation and promoting human welfare. The evolutionary debunking argument challenges moral realism by arguing that our moral judgments result from evolutionary processes that were selected for their adaptive value rather than their truth-tracking capacity. If beliefs about evil evolved because they promoted survival and reproduction rather than because they accurately represented objective moral facts, then the evolutionary explanation of these beliefs undermines their epistemic credentials. This argument parallels debunking arguments about perceptual beliefs that result from hallucinations or wishful thinking, suggesting that evolutionary origins make moral beliefs unreliable guides to moral truth even if such truth exists. However, The debunking argument faces challenges in explaining why evolutionary origins undermine moral beliefs any more than they undermine empirical beliefs, which also evolved for adaptive rather than purely truth-tracking purposes. The problem of evil properties involves determining what kinds of metaphysical entities evil acts, evil character, and evil institutions could be if they exist objectively. Evil acts might be complex relational properties involving agents, victims, circumstances, and consequences. But specifying these relations precisely enough to ground objective moral facts proves difficult. Evil character might consist in dispositional properties that manifest under appropriate conditions, but explaining how these dispositions relate to particular actions and outcomes requires controversial assumptions about human psychology and moral development. Evil institutions might involve emergent properties of social arrangements that exceed the properties of individual participants, but emergent social properties raise difficult questions about their ontological status and causal powers. The temporal and modal aspects of evil create additional metaphysical puzzles about the existence conditions for moral properties. If someone attempts murder but fails due to circumstances beyond their control, it seems they perform an evil act despite causing no actual harm, suggesting that evil can exist independently of its typical consequences. Similarly, if someone would act evilly under certain circumstances but never encounters those circumstances, it remains unclear whether they possess evil character or merely the potential for evil that never becomes actual. These cases require moral metaphysics that can handle counterfactual and dispositional properties while preserving the connection between moral facts and actual features of the world that make moral judgment practically relevant. The relationship between individual and collective evil raises questions about whether moral properties can be instantiated by group entities or only by individual agents with appropriate psychological capacities. If institutions can be genuinely evil rather than merely composed of evil individuals, then moral properties must be able to exist at levels of organization that exceed individual psychology. This requires either expanding our ontology to include group agents with moral properties, or explaining how individual moral facts can generate collective moral facts through composition principles that preserve moral content across levels of organization. The metaphysics of collective evil thus connects to broader questions about group agency, emergence, and the relationship between individual and social reality that extend beyond moral philosophy to general metaphysics and social ontology. Part 18. Evil and Punishment, Retributivist and Consequentialist Justifications. The justification of punishment for evil acts creates fundamental tensions between retributivist approaches that treat punishment as intrinsically deserved by wrongdoers and consequentialist approaches that justify punishment only through its beneficial effects on crime prevention, victim satisfaction, or social order. Retributivists argue that evil acts create moral debts that can only be discharged through appropriate suffering imposed on wrongdoers, making punishment a requirement of justice independent of its consequences. Consequentialists maintain that punishment can only be justified by its instrumental value in deterring future crime, incapacitating dangerous individuals, or expressing social values that promote cooperation and law-abiding behavior. These competing approaches generate systematic disagreements about appropriate punishment levels, acceptable methods of punishment, and the treatment of cases where desert and utility conflict. The desert-based justification for punishment faces immediate challenges in explaining why wrongdoers deserve to suffer for their evil acts, rather than merely owing compensation to their victims or society. The notion that evil acts create genuine obligations for wrongdoers to accept punishment requires controversial assumptions about moral debt and the relationship between wrongdoing and deserved suffering that many find intuitively problematic. Furthermore, if punishment is intrinsically deserved, then it should be imposed even when it serves no beneficial purpose, and might even cause net harm to everyone involved, including victims and wrongdoers themselves. This commitment to punishment, despite harmful consequences, conflicts with widely shared moral intuitions about the importance of promoting human welfare and avoiding unnecessary suffering. Testing retributivist theories against cases involving moral luck reveals systematic problems in connecting punishment to moral desert. Two equally reckless drivers who make identical choices may deserve different punishments if one kills a pedestrian while the other does not, yet this difference depends on factors beyond either driver's control. If punishment should track moral desert rather than actual consequences, then cases with identical choices should receive identical punishment regardless of lucky or unlucky outcomes. Yet this implication conflicts with both legal practice and moral intuition, which typically treat successful wrongdoing as more serious than unsuccessful attempts, even when intention and effort remain constant. The proportionality problem for retributivist punishment requires explaining how different types and degrees of wrongdoing correspond to different types and degrees of appropriate punishment. Desert-based theories need principled methods for comparing the moral gravity of different evil acts and matching them to punishments of equivalent severity. But developing such methods proves extremely difficult. How should we compare financial fraud that ruins many families to violent assault that seriously injures one person? And how should either be matched to specific punishments like imprisonment, fines, or community service? Without reliable methods for making these comparisons, retributivist punishment becomes arbitrary in ways that undermine its claim to serve justice rather than mere social convenience or emotional satisfaction. Consequentialist justifications for punishment face their own difficulties in explaining why punishment should be imposed on particular individuals rather than on whoever would be most effectively deterred by punishment. If punishment is justified only by its beneficial consequences, then punishing innocent people who can be effectively framed might be justified when it produces better deterrent effects than punishing actual wrongdoers who are difficult to catch. Similarly, punishing minor wrongdoers very severely might be justified if it produces enough deterrence to outweigh the unfairness to those punished, violating widely shared intuitions about the relationship between wrongdoing and appropriate punishment. Pure consequentialist approaches struggle to explain why actual guilt should be a necessary condition for justified punishment rather than merely one factor to be weighed against others in calculating optimal consequences. The effectiveness problem for deterrence-based punishment involves empirical questions about whether punishment actually reduces crime and whether alternative approaches might achieve better results at lower social and moral costs. Research on deterrent effects shows mixed results, with some studies suggesting modest deterrent benefits, while others find little evidence that punishment levels significantly affect crime rates. Furthermore, imprisonment creates its own problems through family disruption, reduced employment prospects, and exposure to criminal cultures that may increase rather than decrease future criminal behavior. If punishment proves ineffective or counterproductive in reducing crime, then consequentialist justifications collapse unless punishment serves other valuable purposes that outweigh its costs and harmful effects. The expressive theory of punishment attempts to bridge retributivist and consequentialist approaches by arguing that punishment serves the valuable social function of expressing condemnation of wrongdoing and affirming shared moral values. According to this view, punishment communicates moral messages to wrongdoers, victims, and the broader public that help maintain social cooperation and moral solidarity, while providing appropriate recognition of victims' suffering and wrongdoers' responsibility. This expressive function may justify punishment even when it has limited deterrent effects, since the communication of moral values serves important social purposes independently of crime prevention. However, the expressive theory faces questions about whether symbolic communication justifies imposing serious harms on individuals, and whether the messages actually communicated through punishment practices match the intended moral content rather than expressing objectionable values like vengeance or social hierarchy. The restorative justice alternative challenges traditional punishment approaches by focusing on repairing harm caused by wrongdoing rather than inflicting deserved suffering or achieving deterrent effects. Restorative approaches bring together wrongdoers, victims, and community members to address the consequences of crime and develop agreements about how to repair damage and prevent future wrongdoing. This approach promises to address victim needs more effectively than traditional punishment, while promoting wrongdoer accountability and rehabilitation in ways that reduce recidivism. Yet restorative justice faces practical limitations in cases involving serious crimes, uncooperative wrongdoers, or victims who want retribution rather than a restoration, and theoretical questions about whether repair can fully address the moral significance of evil acts. The problem of mercy creates puzzles for both retributivist and consequentialist approaches by raising questions about when deserved or useful punishment should be forgiven or reduced. Mercy appears to be a virtue that involves choosing not to impose deserved punishment in appropriate circumstances, but this conflicts with retributivist claims that justice requires imposing deserved punishment and consequentialist claims that punishment should be imposed whenever it produces optimal consequences. If punishment is truly deserved or genuinely useful, then mercy may be unfair to victims or society by failing to provide appropriate justice or deterrence. Yet mercy seems morally valuable in cases involving genuine repentance, changed circumstances, or disproportionate impact on innocent parties, suggesting that rigid application of punishment principles may sometimes conflict with broader moral considerations that should override narrow focus on desert or consequences. The institutional design problem for punishment involves creating systems that can implement justified punishment approaches while addressing practical constraints involving evidence, resources, error rates, and political pressures. Even if we could develop adequate theoretical justifications for punishment, implementing these theories requires institutions that can reliably identify wrongdoers, impose appropriate punishments, and avoid systematic errors and abuses that undermine theoretical justifications. Criminal justice systems operate under significant constraints involving imperfect evidence, limited resources, and political pressures that may distort punishment practices in ways that serve neither desert nor deterrence effectively. The gap between theoretical justification and practical implementation suggests that punishment theory must address institutional as well as philosophical questions about how to design systems that can achieve justified punishment in realistic social and political conditions. Part 19. Cross-cultural perspectives on evil. The comparative study of evil concepts across different cultural and religious traditions reveals both striking convergences and fundamental disagreements about what constitutes evil behavior, evil character, and appropriate responses to evil that challenge universalist approaches to moral philosophy. While virtually all human cultures condemn unprovoked violence against in-group members, practices that some cultures consider heinously evil, such as certain sexual behaviors, religious expressions or social arrangements, other cultures treat as morally neutral or even virtuous. This variation raises questions about whether evil represents a universal human moral category with culturally variable applications, or a fundamentally culture-bound concept that cannot ground cross-cultural moral criticism or universal human rights claims. Understanding evil requires examining how different cultural frameworks structure moral thinking while remaining sensitive to power relations and historical contexts that may distort intercultural dialogue about moral issues. The universalism versus relativism debate in comparative approaches to evil involves determining which aspects of evil concepts reflect universal human moral insights versus culturally specific moral traditions that may not be legitimate bases for criticizing other cultural practices. Universalists argue that core evil categories like unprovoked harm, betrayal of trust, and systematic oppression appear across all human cultures, suggesting shared moral knowledge that transcends cultural difference. Relativists contend that what counts as unprovoked betrayal or oppression depends on cultural frameworks for understanding persons, relationships, and social organization that cannot be evaluated from neutral cross-cultural perspectives. This debate has practical implications for international law, humanitarian intervention, and development policy that require taking positions on contested moral issues while respecting cultural diversity and avoiding moral imperialism. Testing universal evil claims against specific cultural practices reveals the complexity of making cross-cultural moral judgments without imposing particular cultural perspectives inappropriately. Practices like arranged marriage, female circumcision, or caste systems appear obviously evil from some cultural perspectives while being defended as traditional, religiously mandated, or socially beneficial from others. Simple condemnation of these practices risks cultural imperialism that ignores their meaning and function within different social systems, while uncritical acceptance risks abandoning moral criticism of practices that cause genuine harm to vulnerable individuals. Developing appropriate frameworks for cross-cultural moral evaluation requires methods that can distinguish between legitimate cultural difference and harmful practices, while acknowledging the cultural embeddedness of all moral judgment, including our own. The role of religious frameworks in structuring evil concepts creates additional complexity in cross-cultural moral comparison. Since religious traditions often provide comprehensive worldviews that integrate cosmology, anthropology, and ethics in ways that resist piecemeal moral evaluation. Religious concepts of evil typically connect individual moral behavior to broader cosmic struggles between good and evil forces, making moral judgment inseparable from theological commitments about the nature of reality and human destiny. This integration creates challenges for secular moral philosophy that seeks to evaluate religious moral claims without accepting their theological foundations, and for interfaith dialogue that must address moral disagreements while respecting religious differences. Furthermore, the historical role of religious differences in justifying warfare, persecution, and cultural destruction complicates contemporary efforts to learn from religious moral traditions while avoiding their potential for promoting intergroup conflict. The power dynamics in cross-cultural moral discourse raise questions about whose voices are heard and whose moral frameworks are treated as legitimate in international forums and academic discussions about evil. Western philosophical and legal traditions have dominated international human rights discourse and academic moral philosophy, potentially marginalizing non-Western approaches to understanding evil and appropriate responses to wrongdoing. This marginalization may reflect not just political power, but also linguistic, educational and institutional advantages that make some cultural perspectives more accessible to international audiences than others. Addressing these power imbalances requires developing inclusive methods for cross-cultural moral dialogue that can accommodate different styles of moral reasoning and communication while maintaining standards for productive intellectual exchange. The historical dimension of cross-cultural moral comparison involves examining how concepts of evil have developed and changed within cultural traditions, while acknowledging that all cultural traditions are internally diverse and contested. Contemporary practices and beliefs within any culture represent particular historical developments rather than timeless cultural essences, making it inappropriate to treat current practices as definitive expressions of cultural moral positions. Furthermore, cultures influence each other through contact, conflict and exchange in ways that make pure cultural difference rare and hybrid cultural forms increasingly common in contemporary global contexts. These historical and dynamic aspects of culture complicate cross-cultural moral comparison by making it difficult to identify stable cultural units for comparison while acknowledging that cultural frameworks continue to shape moral thinking in powerful ways. The translation problem in cross-cultural evil concepts involves determining whether moral terms from different languages and cultural contexts refer to the same moral phenomena or represent fundamentally different ways of organizing moral experience. Terms that are typically translated as evil in different languages may have different connotations, scope, and logical relationships that affect their moral content in ways that simple translation obscures. Similarly, some cultures may organize moral thinking around concepts that have no direct equivalence in other cultural contexts, making comprehensive cross-cultural comparison impossible without distorting some cultural perspectives. These translation difficulties suggest that cross-cultural moral understanding may require learning to navigate multiple moral vocabularies rather than seeking common denominators that reduce all moral traditions to familiar conceptual frameworks. The practical implications of cross-cultural perspectives on evil involve developing approaches to international cooperation, conflict resolution, and global governance that can accommodate moral diversity while addressing shared problems that require coordinated response. Issues like environmental degradation, economic inequality, and violent conflict affect all human communities, but may require solutions that respect different cultural values and priorities in ways that complicate simple, universal approaches. Similarly, international institutions for addressing serious crimes and human rights violations must balance universal standards with sensitivity to local contexts and meanings in ways that avoid both relativistic paralysis and cultural imperialism. These practical challenges suggest that cross-cultural approaches to evil must integrate theoretical understanding with practical problem-solving in ways that can promote human flourishing while respecting cultural diversity. The epistemological implications of cross-cultural evil studies raise questions about how exposure to different cultural perspectives should affect individual moral judgment and confidence in particular moral positions. Learning about cultural variation in evil concepts might promote moral humility and openness to different perspectives, but it might also undermine moral conviction and commitment in ways that prevent effective moral action. Furthermore, some cultural perspectives on evil may be more adequate than others for addressing contemporary moral challenges, making uncritical cultural relativism as problematic as uncritical moral universalism. Navigating these epistemological challenges requires developing frameworks for learning from cultural diversity while maintaining capacity for moral judgment and action that can address serious moral problems effectively. The methodological challenges in cross-cultural evil studies involve developing research approaches that can investigate moral concepts across different cultural contexts without imposing inappropriate theoretical frameworks or missing important cultural meanings. Anthropological methods that emphasize thick description and cultural context may capture important nuances, but make cross-cultural comparison difficult, while philosophical methods that emphasize logical analysis and theoretical generalization may miss culturally specific meanings and functions. Integrating these different methodological approaches requires collaborative research that brings together scholars from different disciplines and cultural backgrounds in ways that can promote mutual understanding while maintaining intellectual rigor. Such collaboration faces practical challenges involving language, institutional support, and academic incentives, but may be essential for developing adequate understanding of evil as both universal and culturally variable phenomena. Part 20. The Future of Evil: Technology, Society and Moral Evolution. The rapid technological and social changes characterizing contemporary global society create new possibilities for both evil and good that challenge traditional moral frameworks and require fundamental reconsideration of how evil manifests and should be addressed in emerging social conditions. Digital technologies enable new forms of harm through cyberbullying, surveillance, manipulation, and social isolation, while also providing unprecedented opportunities for moral education, social coordination, and global cooperation in addressing shared challenges. Similarly, advances in biotechnology, artificial intelligence and social organization create possibilities for both human enhancement and human degradation that exceed historical experience, and may require moral frameworks that traditional approaches to evil have not anticipated. Understanding the future of evil requires examining how technological and social change affect the conditions under which evil emerges, while developing moral resources for addressing challenges that may be qualitatively different from those faced by previous generations. The digital transformation of social life creates new contexts for evil behavior that combine features of traditional moral problems with novel aspects that resist analysis through established moral categories. Online harassment can cause psychological harm comparable to physical violence, while operating through mechanisms of social exclusion, reputation, destruction and identity manipulation that differ significantly from paradigm cases of cruelty and bullying. The scale, persistence and anonymity possible in digital environments allow relatively minor individual contributions to aggregate into systematic harm that exceeds what any individual participant intends or controls, creating collective evil that emerges through technological mediation rather than direct social coordination. Furthermore, the global reach and permanent record-keeping capacity of digital systems means that harmful acts can have consequences across time and space that traditional moral frameworks focused on local and temporary effects have not adequately addressed. The artificial intelligence revolution raises fundamental questions about moral agency and responsibility that may require reconceptualizing evil to accommodate non-human agents that can cause significant harm through autonomous decision-making. If AI systems become capable of making independent choices that cause harm to humans, traditional frameworks that locate evil in human character and intention may prove inadequate for moral evaluation and social response. The distributed nature of AI system development, training and deployment creates complex responsibility attribution problems, where programmers, trainers, users, and the systems themselves all contribute to harmful outcomes in ways that resist traditional moral analysis. Furthermore, AI systems may be capable of forms of manipulation, deception, and harm that exceed human psychological and intellectual capacities, creating power asymmetries that traditional approaches to evil have not anticipated and may not be able to address adequately. The biotechnology possibilities for human enhancement and modification raise questions about whether evil should be addressed through moral education and social reform or through direct biological intervention that alters the psychological and cognitive foundations of moral behavior. If evil results from specific neural patterns, genetic predispositions, or biochemical imbalances, then medical or technological interventions might prove more effective than traditional moral approaches for preventing and treating evil behavior. However, biological approaches to moral improvement raise serious questions about human freedom, dignity, and authenticity that may make them worse than the evils they seek to address. Furthermore, decisions about which traits to enhance or modify necessarily involve controversial value judgments about human nature and social organization that may themselves be subject to evil manipulation by those who control enhancement technologies. The global interconnection of contemporary society creates new forms of collective evil that emerge through the interaction of individual choices, institutional practices, and technological systems across national and cultural boundaries. Climate change, economic inequality, and social fragmentation represent systematic harms that result from countless individual and institutional decisions, but cannot be addressed through traditional approaches focused on individual moral responsibility or local social reform. These global challenges require new forms of moral cooperation and institutional coordination that may exceed current human capacity for collective action, while remaining urgent moral imperatives that cannot be avoided or postponed. The mismatch between global moral challenges and local moral psychology and institutions may represent a fundamental source of future evil that current moral frameworks are poorly equipped to address. The acceleration of social change creates temporal problems for moral development and education that may make traditional approaches to preventing evil increasingly inadequate. If technological and social conditions change faster than moral traditions can adapt, then moral education may prepare people for moral challenges that no longer exist while failing to address new forms of evil that emerge from novel social and technological conditions. Similarly, the institutions and practices that traditionally support moral development, families, communities, religious organizations, and educational systems, may be disrupted by rapid change in ways that undermine their capacity to transmit moral knowledge and support moral character development. This institutional disruption may create generations of individuals who lack adequate moral resources for addressing the challenges they face, potentially creating cycles of moral failure that compound existing problems while generating new forms of evil. The possibility of moral progress versus moral decline in future social development raises questions about whether technological and social advancement necessarily improves human moral capacity, or might instead create new vulnerabilities to evil that exceed the benefits of moral advancement. Optimistic perspectives suggest that increased education, global communication and technological capacity will enable humans to address moral challenges more effectively while reducing the conditions that generate evil behavior. Pessimistic perspectives worry that technological power without corresponding moral development will create unprecedented opportunities for evil while undermining the social conditions that traditionally support moral behavior and character development. Evaluating these competing perspectives requires understanding how technological and social change affect fundamental features of human moral psychology and social organization, rather than simply extrapolating from current trends or assuming that change necessarily represents progress. The role of moral philosophy and ethical reflection in shaping future social development involves determining whether philosophical analysis can provide useful guidance for addressing emerging moral challenges, or whether novel situations require practical experimentation and adaptation that exceeds theoretical anticipation. Traditional moral theories may provide valuable resources for thinking about new moral challenges, but they may also constrain moral imagination in ways that prevent recognition of genuinely novel moral problems and opportunities. Furthermore, the increasing technical complexity of moral challenges may require interdisciplinary collaboration between moral philosophers and specialists in technology, psychology and social organization that challenges traditional boundaries between theoretical and practical moral knowledge. The future of evil may depend partly on whether moral philosophy can adapt to address challenges that require integration of moral reflection with technical expertise and practical problem-solving in ways that preserve moral insight while remaining relevant to actual social and technological developments. The ultimate questions about human moral development involve whether evil represents a permanent feature of human nature that must be continually managed and contained, or a developmental problem that could theoretically be overcome through sufficient moral, technological and social progress. If evil stems from fundamental features of human psychology like self-interest, in-group loyalty and limited empathy, then future societies may develop better methods for managing these tendencies, but cannot eliminate them without fundamentally altering human nature itself. Conversely, if evil results from specific social conditions like inequality, competition and cultural conflict, then future societies might achieve forms of social organization that eliminate or dramatically reduce evil behavior while preserving human freedom and dignity. This fundamental question about the relationship between human nature and social organization affects how we should approach moral education, social policy and technological development in ways that may determine whether future societies achieve moral progress or create new forms of evil that exceed historical experience. The legacy question for contemporary moral thinking about evil involves determining what insights and approaches from current moral philosophy should be preserved and transmitted to future generations facing moral challenges we cannot fully anticipate. Rather than attempting to solve future moral problems in advance, current moral reflection might focus on developing flexible moral resources and robust moral institutions that can adapt to changing conditions while preserving essential moral insights about human dignity, flourishing, and social cooperation. This requires balancing confidence in moral knowledge that has proven valuable across different historical contexts with humility about the limitations of current moral understanding and openness to moral learning from future experience. The future of evil may depend ultimately on whether each generation can contribute to moral progress while remaining open to moral correction and development that allows human moral capacity to grow in response to new challenges and opportunities.